This
Okay, so
conference
let's,
will now be recorded.
okay, I think we have 4. So we're waiting on Tim, Jeremy, and Jody. Is that right? Do we know if they're all coming? I haven't heard anything from anyone, so I'm assuming everyone's coming. We did get confirmation, right, Lauren? Isn't that, okay.
I know Tim is definitely getting on.
There might be some question about Jody.
I'm here.
Oh, you are. Hi,
Oh,
Jody.
Jody's here.
Name.
Okay.
I'm just not, I'm used to Zoom. Where do I go to change my name on this one?
It's
No
when you
idea.
log in. It's whoever you are, Jody.
No, I can change my name, can't I?
You go to settings,
Presumably.
perhaps.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
We can
Yes,
hear you.
we
I can hear you.
Doug, where do I go to change my name?
No idea.
I think
I don't
it's
really,
usually
I don't
when
really
you sign.
know.
I find this so much less user-friendly than Zoom.
Yeah, I have really no idea.
Oh, if you go to settings, and
Yeah.
then
Yeah, I'm on
It's called
settings.
the spin wheel.
there's a little toggle area bottom right. Click on that, and under general, you'll see something that says name, and it says always
Got it,
show my
thank
name
you.
and email like this, and you can
Thank
put your
you,
name.
thanks, got it.
Okay. Well, so like we have 5. I think we're waiting on Jeremy and Tim, but why don't I at least open the meeting? So I want to call to order a Board of Ed working session for Tuesday, April 21, 2020. And why don't we just give them maybe 2 more minutes? We'll start at 6:07 and see if they log in, and then.
Hey, this is Jeremy.
Oh, hey, Jeremy. Okay.
Tim's here.
Tim's
I am
here
here.
now. Okay. Okay. Let me print on this thing. Okay. So what the goal of last session and this session is for the board to continue to have conversations with regards to obviously a fluctuating and changing budget. And I think we might have some water in the background. If you don't have your phone on mute, if you could mute it, please, now, we'd appreciate it. What we hope to really do today is go through 5 or 6 key topics that I think have come up over the course of the last few weeks. We've certainly gotten a fair amount of emails about these topics, and give the board an opportunity to share some thoughts. Most of these were teed up in the last working session when Valerie and other members of the administration, Valerie Moraine and other members of the administration, went through some of their thinking on their proposals that the board has had an opportunity to go back and really think through and connect with each other here and there in pairs and whatnot, connect with community members, and really better understand this kind of very large puzzle that we're trying to put together. So with that, before I keep going, are there any key, I don't want to take a lot of time going through a PowerPoint and slides. I really want to reserve this session for the board to discuss and, where needed, ask administrators for further clarification or further information. And it very well may be that there are some things we need more information on in the coming week before next week's Board of Ed meeting, where we will obviously continue this conversation. And so I really want to reserve this time for the board to have some conversations on these topics. But before we get there, Valerie and Maureen, in these slides that you've put together, and as well the principals, the budget managers, is there anything particular that you want to draw our attention to that has changed in these slides in the last week?
Why don't I start? And then Maureen definitely has some additional information on the basis of emails that we received or follow-up from the last work session. The forecast has not changed with regards to the significant impact that the COVID-19 has had and will have on not only the state of New York, but all school districts. So that is still very much a part of all the circles, whether it's New York State Council of School Superintendents. Obviously, the board knows through NYSBA. Maureen, can speak to the groups that she's part of. There's her business official group. There's not a single person, who's involved in the education orbit who's not talking about how stunning the future reductions may be on the basis of what's happening, and certainly the conversation that our governor is having with our president today hopefully will yield some good news. But we still want to punctuate how critical it is for the board to consider our need to provide, develop reserves that help us to weather the 3 assessments that are coming. That has not changed. The governor gave us, a heads up. Our first assessment actually is next week. So the assessment is simply your announcement of how much more the state's going to take, or Albany's going to take, from our state aid. The next announcement is June 30th and followed by December 31st. So we really want to, punctuate just the importance of knowing that, we really can't afford to, go back into the restoration mode, to a large extent. I mean, it's up to the board to make decisions with regards to the proposals. But what Maureen is going to share is, how critical it is for us to be prepared for these 3 assessments and the future impact of the COVID-19 on this budget, and on the state that we are going to live with and have to reconcile, certainly for the next 5 years and beyond. And we still haven't seen the sort of light at the end of the tunnel, the degree to which, the trickle effect is going to happen in our economy, things that we may not have seen yet, but are certainly coming because we have lived through, the Great Recession of 2008. So that's really sort of all, the backdrop that I want to just, bring to the board's attention. And I know you're aware of it from our last presentation, and then what you also have been reading through NYSBA and other, networks that you're part of. So this budget has to be seen through that lens, the impact of this unprecedented financial disruption, that will impact our budget, and it will certainly be a basis of your considerations with regards to the proposals. I'll turn it over to Maureen.
Yeah, so just to continue, I think it's been so challenging, and I think, I'm happy that the board has decided to do, have these work sessions and continue, until once we have a definitive date in which the board has to adopt the budget, which we still don't have the final date on that. But because of the fact that, I think next week will give us some, not so, I mean, it's a shorter period in how this impact will, the state, what they'll report out on April 30th, and we'll have some sense of what losses that they've incurred during this time. And I think it'll, be helpful as we move along, and we'll have a little bit more information. But as Valerie had mentioned, everyone, not only every single person I've spoken to, my counterparts, it's not as much, we're thinking about 2021, but really it's looking at it in a definitely, we always look in 5 years, but really looking at like a 2 to 3 year window and saying, what is, oh, I'm getting some feedback. Can you hear me, Valerie?
Jody, can.
I do, but there is an echo, Maureen.
Yes. Yes. I don't know what, yeah, I could just,
Your microphone.
I don't know if it's other people's microphones that are echoing, but I think to your point, I think this has been a really challenging budget and we are extremely, we're really looking, we're speaking about 2021, that's been a focus of our conversation, but I think what we do need to speak to tonight and really make sure we're thinking about the not only the next year, but the year after, because we know that the effects of this will be with us. And as Valerie had mentioned, thinking about what our plans are even beyond next year with, any monies that we may have available and what would be the best way to think about using those to really think about, what the effects of this COVID is going to do. And again, we still have no idea. None of us, of course, do. Like, will we be back in school? How long is this going to go on for? And what the overall economy, what this is going to do, and the impact it'll have on our schools. So, same kind of thing. We're also looking. Our next sales tax payment we'll be receiving the beginning of May, and at that point it may be beyond our budget vote. But I've had colleagues who are actually cutting that number significantly more than we're proposing. So, as much as some of the cuts may seem a little bit significant, some districts are really going in and really even reducing those more significantly. So, there's a possibility that some of the revenue projections, as much as I think they're, not completely off, there's also that chance that if in fact some of those, in addition to the state aid, could in fact be a bit lower than we had hoped as well. But that being said, I mean, the good thing is we've been working on this from, the onset of the COVID. And I think, we've had a lot of meetings to discuss it and with our team internally, externally, working with the board. And although, none of us want to cut anything, it's I do think we're in a good space overall. I think we present different options to the board and we can look at, what's the best way, So we can kind of hit some of the slides.
Maureen, hold on one second. Sometimes that echo is because someone's got two instances on at their house and it's echoing in. So if you're not talking, please mute.
Yeah, because I didn't hear the echo before, just the one. So if we can, I don't know if you want to look, I put some additional slides together that based on people, some of what the feedback we've received. Still getting feedback.
Yeah, what has to happen is you can't have both the phone on and your computer. So you have to choose one or the other. I think that's also contributing to the, the echo.
Jody, can you mute? It's
Thank
coming
you.
up as you talking.
I'm trying to, just trying to.
Okay. Do we see if anybody else's mic is, okay, that's
Don't
her
need to
again.
make-
Anybody else's mic is, okay, that's her again. Okay, so we can go to some of the slides that, we can go to some of the slides, questions. I don't know. Valerie, I'm getting feedback.
I am too.
Yeah,
It's pretty bad. It's pretty
Hold
bad.
on, let's see. Jody, you want to just try dialing back in?
Yep, I'm gonna do that.
Okay.
Can't even get out of this. Yep.
Me?
Okay.
I'm here.
All right,
What
that's
slide
better.
do you want to go to?
The new information, Maureen?
Yeah, I have those. If we did, you have to go into the slide deck a bit, Janine. I'm sorry, I can,
Which one? You know what
let me-
slide number?
I mean, there were a couple questions around, I'll get to them. Let me look, I have it on my side. Just give me one. I mean, I know that there were some questions that we can kind of go back over.
Yeah, I think, Maureen, we're going to have to wait until we get this settled. Jody, are you able to hit mute? I can see your mic is not muted. Let's just see if that's it. If that's not, then.
Janine, are you logged in as an administrator? Are you able to log in as an administrator? Are you able to log in?
Jeremy, can you mute yours? Jeremy, can you mute yours? And we have Andy Zimmerman needs to mute his mic. Caller number 2, caller 7, caller 8, caller 4, please all mute your mics. What I think is happening is people have called in from telephones, and that's why we're seeing a lot of it.
I think we're good. I think it was Jody's computer. But Janine, are you able to mute people from your side so we don't have to,
I have to mute everybody, so I can't like just unmute. If Valerie and Maureen want to speak, I can't have just those two speaking. Like,
got it.
if I mute,
Can't they unmute themselves?
It seems to be working now,
We'll
so
need-
let's just keep rolling here. I think we're
Maureen,
good.
if you tell me the slide number.
Maureen, you're on mute.
So I was looking at the slide deck. So why don't you go into, what slide is this? Go into like about 25, Janine. I think it's good just to kind of remind people, you know, we've been cutting on both sides of the budget. There were, you know, just to kind of remind people where we currently are and what the budget currently reflects. So you need to get beyond this. What slide number is this?
Tell me the slide number. I can find it on my other laptop and then get to it on this one.
Okay, go to slide 25. So again, you know, just to remind people, these are things, actually, some of the dollars that we've saved. And again, the possibility of a further closure, and we'll speak later this evening about, you know, I think there's been some people and some even board members saying, you know, is there some of that money that we should either look to offset some expenses or, you know, use it to either lower the levy for this year. And we're going to kind of get into that later, but just to kind of remind people where we are, and these are the summary of reductions. And although it is always going to appear that a lot of the reductions are at the instructional, but the instructional is about accounts for more than 80% of our budget. So although we have cut quite a bit of things, we could just, again, remind people what those things are. Again, operations and maintenance, this was off of our first. We've also cut security and other things away from the classroom. You could advance, Janine, please. Can you go to the next one, Janine? These are also some other contractual services and reconditioning. We have also reduced the majority of our PD budget, and what remains of the PD budget. And I know it kind of, when people saw the first rendition of the budget, and they're probably not quite clear where we currently are. Right now, we have $50,000 in our professional development budget. But in order just, all districts have a certain level of membership with Southern Westchester, Northern Westchester, BOCES, in order just to have updates, things that we really need them to be the conduit of all the different kind of things that come through the state. So there is a level of service in order for our staff to even be able to attend a lot of, meaning our teachers to attend a lot of workshops and PD that are critically important to them. So there's about, 50,000, about 20 to 25,000 is just because we're, part of the BOCES organization, and every school district in the area pays for that membership. So beyond that, we have about $25,000 outside of the, Gravity's work, which again was reduced by $30,000 over the course, the recommended for next year. So, just to be clear, there is not a lot of money left in these budget lines. I would say it's probably at one of the lowest levels of funding that it's been for many, many years. This year, just to give you some example of that, we had $114,000 just in BOCES this year, and next year we're recommending it to be 50. And there actually 114 was actually kind of low because there were many things that we were hoping to do. So we did cut, we cut there significantly. District furniture, there's very little money left there. And again, I had mentioned before, we do have 8 air conditionings in the building, and as those break in classrooms, we do need to replace those. So we just have a little bit of money left there. And we've really tried to go in across the system and really reduce codes down. Next, Janine, I just wanted to kind of, I know that maybe with all these different slides we've produced, people may feel like it's only teachers, but we really have gone through many parts of our budget. You can skip this, Janine, because this was covered last time. You can go forward, please. Forward. Keep going until I tell you to stop. Okay, so this right here, I think, again, just to remind people, can you go back one, Janine? Back one, back. I wish I could control the point. You have to go, no, you're going in the wrong direction. You have to go backwards. You skipped over where I need. You have to go back.
You want to get to slide 31,
before
Janine.
this?
Look for slide 31.
Yeah, I have to look at it somewhere else so I can see what it is.
But if you went back, you
Proposed
would-
additional.
Yeah. I think it was just a summary slide, and again, just, you know, without it even being up there, you know, we will continue. This is a process that, you know, even up until that time the board adopts the budget, you know, we're always looking whether, and we'll talk a little bit about transportation later. It's always an area we look to be as efficient as possible. This is the slide, and I know much of it, again, Janine, the slide you were just on. The summary
This is
slide.
it
No, you passed it. You were on it. You passed it.
on my
But
screen.
anyway, the bottom line is that, you know, we are going to continue to look at ways to, if there's something we can bring down, whether it be copiers, whether it be any contract, we'll continue to, you know, do that. And there is a point in which there's, as much as there's a little bit more analysis that needs to happen. But I just want to remind that we are trying to look and tighten up every department where we can. And what we can get into this. Okay, you're going to have to go. I don't know if you just want the board to jump in. I mean, I had a little summary update on the transportation, Valerie, just to let people know where we are currently.
That's good. Let's go to
What
that.
slide number, Maureen?
Yeah. No, unfortunately, I didn't print out my slide. I printed them and left them at work.
Keep advancing. We'll find it.
Yeah, just
Is
keep
that
advancing.
towards the end of the presentation?
It is fairly new, so I
Transportation
will.
out of district. This is
Can someone also, either maybe Valerie or Maureen, can you send the board a copy of these? Because I don't think we've seen the updated ones. And I know we'll put them up for the public to see, but you know, at some point, but
Oh, no, but I'd share it with you, Doug, so it's the slide, so when I make a revision on it, it automatically updates whatever, you're in that, yeah, like I've shared that presentation with you, so,
yeah.
you know, but it'll.
So I should just,
Let's just, yeah, I mean, we can go, can you go back one slide, Janine? It'll just kind of be a segue into this, the slide right before.
out of district, in district.
No, the slide right before, go backward. Again.
My slide
I think
sharing,
there's-
my screen isn't
there's
sharing.
something, there's a lag.
If
There's some
a
sort of
delay.
lag in the timing. And
Okay,
so
Dick,
whenever,
leave-
ever you, yeah, there you go.
So,
Stop.
you know, transportation, and I know it's something, it's an extremely expensive line item, even though in the grand scheme of things, Hastings as a district really does, you know, there's two things that are in our benefit. It's a very small district, so we don't have to transport a lot of children. We actually do transport in district beyond what we're required to do. And that's not unusual in Westchester, but we actually do that. But in terms of our overall spending, and this is something we just share, I'm sharing this just as a point of context, not to be defensive about it, but just to kind of give you a sense of, we do try to run a very efficient transportation, although it's an expensive service. As a percentage of our overall budget, Hastings ranks 42 out of 48 districts in transportation spending. And that's in Putnam, Westchester County. So we, out of 48 districts, are on the bottom rungs of what we actually spend as a, you know, just a true, it's obviously a percentage of our overall spending, and compares us to other districts. So this is an area that we do really try to be as efficient as possible. Although anything transportation, there are ways that you could reduce it a little bit further, but we, you really need to be thoughtful and think about that, and we can, speak to some of what that would look like. And then also just for some of the other comparisons, and I think Doug thought this was a good slide, just to kind of, give people a sense of how, how we spend our money and where the money really goes. So the first ranking here, and I just wanted just to give people a little context, Wood Hastings is ranked 31 out of 52 districts in total teacher salary. And I'm sorry, Doug, I meant to add some wording to this slide, and I will go back and do that. So when it's on the website, what that really means is that if a teacher were to work in our district, as opposed to the other 52 districts, it takes a teacher and it assumes that a teacher A is in a district for 25 years. And it looks at, depending on what district you worked at, where over the course of time would you make the most money in working. And really what that demonstrates is that our teacher's contract, although some, it's not the most lucrative in Westchester, it actually puts them 31 out of 52 districts. So we really do try to negotiate with our bargaining groups, and this really reflects that although we try to offer as competitive salaries as possible, our teachers out of their counterparts in Westchester are 31st out of 52 in terms of their total compensation. So again, we really do try to negotiate salaries that that put us toward the lower half of the county and Putnam County. And then just in terms of our per pupil spending, and this is 18-19, and I know this is consistent with 19-20 because I could have put that number, but I'm pulling this out of a database. This is not my own calculation of it. This is coming from a central repository that collects this information in all of Westchester based on actual state spending reports. And we do spend we're spending a good amount per student, but just to kind of give you a context, we are the lowest, we're below the median in Westchester in our spending, and we are the lowest in the river towns in our per pupil spending. Again, just another point that we're 21st out of 48 in central office staff spending. And again, that's as a percentage of our budget. The one thing I will say here that works a little differently with central office staff, again, it's a larger district gets the benefit of having like a larger number of a budget to kind of spread that cost. So this is fairly consistent with small districts that most of the time you're going to be a little bit above the median on that. Instructional spending, this is the one thing we really want to explain to people. We are 3rd out of 48 districts in terms of our percentage of budget in instructional spending. Out of 48 districts, all of our spending is in our teachers. Now, I mentioned before our teachers don't make the highest salaries, but we actually do invest in program. What this speaks to is that we have a high investment in our programmatic spending, and it is, demonstrates that where we put our money, and this is when I spoke about where we made the cuts across the board, we've always invested the most money in our instructional plan, and that continues, to be our priority. But that's where the majority of our money is. So when we have to reduce, there's not a lot of other areas to take from because we've really focused our spending to be spent on instruction. So just again, to give you a comparison, and we rank 3rd in instructional spending as a percentage of our budget compared to our counterparts. We've talked a lot about co-curricular and interscholastic spending. This is just a ranking. If you look at it as a percentage of our budget, we're 4th out of 48. So we are, outspending our neighbors. So whether someone has 1 or 2, something that we don't have, as overall in those categories, we're offering more to our students and we're spending, again, focusing our money in instructional spending. Transportation, I mentioned earlier, is just a segue, 46 out of 52 in debt and capital spending. Even with this new bond, we're really out of Westchester have the lowest debt. I mean, sometimes people think when we talk about debt, they thought I was not reporting it correctly because it is on the lower end. So we do make some investments in our infrastructure when they make sense, but we do, attempt to, ensure that we're considering that as a part of our overall spending. And again, at the end, we put our money into our instructional program. And all of these, again, are just to kind of ground us in some facts about, where our money is and how we spend our money. You can go to the next
And
one.
Maureen, in terms of the attribution of this information, is this all found in See Through New York?
That actually, it's through the clearinghouse, Valerie. So what they do is they actually pull the data from everyone's state reporting, and they use it, and they, like, that's what I mean, like, as far as that's pulled from, like, I don't provide that to anybody. They're actually pulling that into the central repository in Putnam, Westchester, and it's a service BOCES does. And it's their whole data service that they put this information together based off of actual state data that they pull.
Great. Thank you, Maureen.
Yeah, so again, that's not, I just pulled this from that. I didn't go around and ask people questions. I just took it, and looking at the information that we receive, and that, it always, to me, is pretty fascinating. And I think not that we have to be like everybody or anybody, but I think gives us a good indication of like how, when we compare to others, how we're spending our money, and it kind of demonstrates that, as we've been talking about, that we do invest in our program, and that's the most important thing is to keep the money in the instructional program, and we do believe that is our focus when we start looking at budgets. Again, this is just to kind of go over, if for those who may not be familiar with it, just how the in-district transportation works. And the reason I mention this, and I know some of my colleagues are also just as a area trying to stay away from the classroom. Of course, you look at transportation. Although it is an extension of the school day, it is an area in which people try, if possible, to save money. So currently, our in-district transportation, the eligibility is listed here. It explains what what would make you eligible at Hastings. But then I just wanted to point out what on the bottom, under the state guidelines, we'd only probably transport about 5 kids. Almost every single child in Hastings that's being transported is based on a local eligibility. Districts like Pleasantville and Pelham, who are similarly square mile sized, don't have in-district transportation. So again, we're not suggesting that we get rid of it, and that actually requires a vote or referendum even to do that. But just to give you a sense that that the in-district transportation is up and above what it's actually almost entirely non-mandated, and it's a local decision. So next, Janine. And this is just to explain like what we kind of have control over. And this is the one we actually do have control over because again, it's beyond the state mandate. Currently, the district is operating 4 in-district buses with a monitor riding on board. Each bus does 2 runs in the morning and afternoon. So we're trying to make us as efficient as possible by doubling up our busing. And then most of our in-district operation is not, we're receiving no state aid on it because again, the state only funds transportation that meets their criteria. So our in-district operation is not aidable. Our current budget for the out-of-district is $308,000. That includes our monitors that ride on the buses each day. And on an average, we transport about 175 students per day across the 4 buses, across the 4 runs, and that puts us at about 50% of ridership, meaning there's double the amount of children scheduled, but only about 50% of the kids actually access the transportation daily. Next, please. Transportation out of district, and this is where we spend the lion's share of our money. Again, part of it is we're required to transport based on state guidelines. We don't do anything that, we only do things that we're required to do. Out of district includes both the CSE placed and parentally placed special ed students, as well as our private school students. It also includes some of the specialized buses that for our in-district children, because it falls under this contract, that ride on small buses because of their individual disability and cannot ride on a large bus. So we have, some children that need that in-district program in the Hastings in-school district. We participate in a shared transportation program with our Quad Village neighbors. And next year, Edgemont is going to be joining the group, and we've been really reaching out to other districts because the larger you expand a consortium, there is more ability for savings because you can combine some routes, and we're looking at different ways to make the operation more efficient, and I can speak to that a little bit later. Janine our current contractor, unfortunately, something that really threw a wrench in our plans, we were notified by our current out-of-district provider, I think I mentioned this last week, that they were in fact dropping our contract. The problem with that is every time the last time we went out to bid, we saw a huge increase, and our out of district contract in terms of what we were paying per bus per live hour places us at the lower end of what people are paying in Westchester County. And again, this was not, this is, Valerie was on the calls with all of our counterparts too. And Ardsley and Irvington, reported out, because they did some of the analysis of it, that they're telling us to expect anywhere up into a 25% increase in out of district transportation costs, just to kind of replicate what we have. So I think I mentioned last time, we're going to have to make some changes, we'll have to make some fairly significant, when I say we'll have to be really, really efficient with our out of district runs, because even just to kind of keep our budget somewhere in where it is today, we'll need to do that to kind of, not only to like try to save additional money, just to not overspend what we currently had planned to spend. We are actually exploring creating our own in-district transportation program. That's something that has been tossed around. We don't actually have the capacity at Hastings, but one of our Quad Village neighbors, as part of the consortium, we're looking to buy buses and almost create our own out-of-district consortium. I mean, the hope is that it may not be likely that we can do it next year, but if not, it's going to be up and running for the following year. And we're actually right now, that's been a big part of my energy is, looking at what we're currently doing, but because right now with the unknown with next year transportation, we've been all working with our quad, both the business officials and superintendents have been on many conference calls the last few weeks, looking and doing the analysis and trying to find buses and trying to see, what can we possibly do because we're so afraid of what, our increase may be in the out of district. Now, our current budget.
Maureen, can I just interject while you're there? As Maureen said, in those conversations with superintendents and business officials and others who are tasked in the districts to, to manage, transportation, even if we went with, one of our, neighboring districts that does have the capacity to actually, park the buses and be sort of the main, district associated with all of that, we would have an initial increase, but over time, the really important part of us sort of owning this rather than being at the mercy of these bus companies is that we will be able to sustain the cost over time. We wouldn't see these spikes of 20% increases, and that's only for next year. The following year, we could potentially have another spike on top of all these other, financial challenges that we've been presenting. So this is a very, very important moment in the, in the relationship and collaboration that's going on with the districts.
Two questions.
Yeah, Valerie, just to be clear, there will be a first year, there won't be a savings. What the hope would be, and they actually are suggesting it would still be a 20% increase. It's the following year because we'd have a lot of upfront having to get into bus leases and there is just an upfront startup. Again, this is based upon, like Valerie said, people who are tasked to do this, people who do this for a living. Some of our superintendents, including Valerie, are familiar. They've come from districts with full programs. They understand the logistics behind it. Chris Harris, Ryan, and Lisa. I mean, each one of the superintendents has lived through, the evolution of creating it. And again, this is based upon, we do know in either of those scenarios, we're going to have an increase next year. But I think we think that not only can we control long-term the cost, we control the quality, and that's also extremely important to us. It is extremely important that we, when you can control your own staff, sometimes we have some issues because unfortunately we don't have the control because we don't hire the people who are, and although many of them are fantastic, not to take away from the wonderful bus drivers we have, but you do you're removed from it and you can't control all of the, and you can't provide maybe some of the, it's more, I think they feel that more people would rather work for a school district, so they may be able to also have a better or a really good pool of people where the bus companies tend to, because they're a profit-based operation, they tend to, lose drivers quite frequently as well. I'm sorry, Jeremy, you had a question?
It's Tim. Okay, first question, just on this next slide. What is this? And then we'll circle back to this 20% increase, but what's the yearly expense, 128K against the budget line item of over $1 million?
Yeah, so again, this is just, I started, and I'm going to do some further analysis of these numbers because it may seem it's not that easy to figure out each individual route because we do share routes and you have to kind of pull out each school and the child on that route. But I just, I know there's been a lot of questions and they are good questions and out of district registration is an expensive thing. So again, I just wanted to give you some sense of how the breakout is of that. We have 63 students currently in our out of district runs. 40 of those children are either CSE parentally placed in district or out, CSE placed by us in our own district or in other schools. And we then also have parentally placed special education students. Currently, we're transporting, that group represents that above group, 40 children go to 21 different schools. Some are located in another state or county. There's some, that we're going over bridges and there's tolls and things such as that also. And then we have 23 students who attend what would be more like a private school traditional. And I've listed the schools we transport to: Fordham, Hackley, Holy Child, Iona Prep, Masters, Marie Regina, and Ursuline. Those are the current schools our children attend. Based upon that and based upon going through the runs today, I'm estimating it's probably right, pretty close to as actual as possible. Yearly expense of about $128,000 for the 23 students to transport
So
them
let's
to the
just stay with me. This is what I want to know.
Yeah.
This 128K refers to what? Just what we're shipping kids to private school?
Yeah, it's the 23 students. And then because, remember how I mentioned about the state gives you aid for that?
It's okay. It's okay. I just want to, so 128K, but we get 35 back in state aid. But the line item, the budget line item is $1,000,016.
Oh, yeah.
It's spot 016. So is that, am I supposed to infer that the 40 CSC placed or parentally placed special education students make up the difference?
Yes. And there's also a management fee that we pay, in the Quad Village because we have to hire people to manage our program.
What's the management fee? I'm just trying to get a breakdown of, so just to do some quick math, just to kind of do an attribution.
And I just want to, also give you just a sense, when you look at an individual run, when you do the analysis, you could have a run in a private school that could be as inexpensive as $800 a year for one of these students. And you could have another, like, for the most part, it's an average of about $4,000 per private school student, the cost of that, providing that transportation. Although, and I have to go down and really break it out on an individual because a lot of these are shared routes in the quad. You could have one that's very, inexpensive, and you could have one that is because there's only 1 or 2 children in the whole quad going in that particular direction. So these tend to go up and down, quite a bit because, again, it's not only about our own children, Tim. Like I mentioned earlier, the Quad Village model, any children that they add onto a bus or take away has an impact on us because most of our buses are shared. So if we have a small...
I lost you. I lost you, Marie.
Seems to have cut out.
Yeah, I'll just text her.
One thing I think that'll be helpful is to put it, I think this is one of the challenges we're having here. This is a moving target. We're still negotiating the contract. We're not even negotiating the contract. We're just looking into possible contract. I think what could be helpful for the board and possibly the public to see as well is some different options, is to look at, here's what it would look like if we kept the budget as is. Here are a couple options to pull more out, and then we can make some decisions. Maybe there's $100 grand, $200 grand, $300 grand, whatever it is. And I have a sense that when we still start pulling hundreds of thousands out, it's going to lead to some impact on children. And I think it's important for us to just be really clear on specifically what the trade-offs are that we're making decisions about. so that the public can better understand if we decide to cut, here's what it is, and here's the trade-off. And if we don't, here's why we decided not to do that. And I know, again, it's a moving target, but I think that would also be helpful to put some options together as we make some decisions around transportation.
And I can interject here, having worked in previous districts that have their own transportation, Tim, and Maureen, by the way, is logging back in. There are always going to be families, taxpayers who choose to send their children to private schools, and it is our obligation to transport them. And that number can range, depending on the size of the district. So that cost is always there. As we discussed last week,
totally. Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think the one thing just with the people going to private schools is, if you have the money to pay for the private school, you can also figure out a way to get your kid to school or take public transportation, right? Like, and I don't think that, I know that doesn't sound great. I think if that sound clip was played back to me, it wouldn't sound perfect. But at the same time, we're talking 5-10 minutes ago about, and trust me, I agree with the sentiment about the potential, and let's call it more likely than not, difficult financial situation we're looking at in 2021, but more importantly, 21-22, when the full extent of state cutbacks.
I can't load it on my computer.
So,
Can you hear me?
Okay, you just called in. Okay.
There's just a case where, if, and this is why, and I don't think we have to have the answer tonight. It's the beauty of having this budget cycle being pushed back so much later because of COVID-19. But at $128,000 for 23 students attending private schools, I would go so far as to say that we've probably been above and beyond, and not just us, but others in the river towns, above and beyond in terms of generous over the years. And we're making hard cuts that are impacting our own students, our own teachers, et cetera. They can share in the cuts as well. So that's my thought, my initial thought process around there. But I agree with Doug that, this line item, so when we look at it at a budget level, on an itemized budget level, we look at it as 1.016 million. And that's why I'm asking the question, the 128,000 is for private schools. In my years doing this, I've actually never broken it down into its component parts. So there's a management fee. Maureen, if you're back on, would you be comfortable estimating what you think
I don't know why I can't connect. This is ridiculous. I can't connect through the link of this is just odd. But yeah, I'm back on. So the rest of it, I just want to go back and I hear you, and this is the one piece, so I just want, and again, we have looked at this, and it should be looked at, it can always be looked at, whether we've looked at it before. I do want to say that none of, if we were to, the options to reduce costs really, beyond, we always try to be efficient. We are joining with others to try to bring down the cost of all of our out-of-district transportation, including the private school students. The other option, and we did look at this probably in 2008, was to, provide people either, in say like Fordham, they would get a Metro North pass. So it's not actually that inexpensive either to put them on those. It would save you some money for sure. I will say that, in speaking, and I don't want to speak out of turn because they may change their mind on this, none of the other river towns, they will continue to bus their kids to private schools. So we can certainly pull our kids off and put them on public transportation. And I have actually I actually followed the Beeline buses years ago, and we mapped out what it would mean for, children to attend those schools. And there, so we can absolutely look to bring that down. There would still be probably, depending on what the student pass is, I'd have to look what it is currently for some of like the Metro North or for some of the Beelines and things like that. But many of the kids, I can tell you, in some of the schools like Hackley and Masters, a lot of them are young kids. They're not older kids.
Right.
They're
Right.
little kids.
Right.
So
Yeah,
I've done
I
the
think
analysis. It's not so simple just to say put them all on Beeline, because some of these kids are in second grade. So I think it's not that simple.
I understand that. And even before we get to that point, I just think for the purposes of the board and trying to do the analysis, you know, I want to just break down this 1.016 number that we look at as a budget number. I just get its general vicinity. How much of that is the management fee that you described? How
Oh,
much
no,
of
it's
that
only, no,
is,
it's like 40,000, it's $40,000.
okay. And then is it a reasonable statement then to say the 40 students that are CSE placed or parentally placed special education, those runs then translate to, sorry, just doing the math.
Like 20,000,
848,000?
like 20, they're like, yeah, they're like 20, because you can have a route that's $100,000 for one student, right? We talked about this. So there are routes
Yep.
like that.
Yeah,
So you have,
okay.
like I said, the same thing here. There could be a route that is fairly inexpensive, but there are some, depending where the schools are located. And, again, I didn't list the schools because I think it's, trying to also be, careful of what, not to identify students in this conversation.
Yes.
Because we do have children who go to singleton schools and different schools. So we didn't, but it's 21 schools is if you think about it, just the amount, that's a lot of schools. It's a lot of places. That is 21 different buses, right, running to those schools, and each bus is close to $100,000. So the only reason it's a little cheaper is because we share them with our counterparts, right? If we were doing this by ourselves, we would be spending $3 million on out-of-district transportation. But we do have efficiencies. I can tell you not all, but I'll just, like, some of our runs, we do even with our CSE and parentally placed, and many of them, if you speak to them, they'll tell you some of them we do try to maximize meaning how many kids in the quad can get on there.
I know. And I don't think we have to. I don't think we need to come up with the answer tonight, because you know what, we're not going to come up with the answer that magically either reduces the private school piece, although we can look at maybe there's an age criteria at which above 6th grade. You take Metro North, something like that, and just try to see how many students does that hit. Does the money make sense relative to the administrative effort? So it's just helpful for me, I think for the other board members as well, to know, to get a look at, okay, we're talking about 21 schools. We're talking about a breakdown between private schools, special education, and management fee. Let me jump to another question for you, which is around this 20% increase. I seem to recall that there are only 2 busing companies. Is that right?
No, well, there's quite a few. I mean, there's not a lot of them that can take on, especially the problem, part of our issue, I think, in terms of competition, there's more than 2 bus companies that exist. There's a few on the larger side that I would say there's 2 that I would say control, because it just, they're big companies that I guess over the course of time may have taken over some of the smaller outfits, and it's almost becoming a little bit, it's not as competitive because it's an expensive business to run. And I think
that's where I'm going with this, because my question is to be budgeting for a 20% increase in a line item that already cost us $1 million in an uncompetitive environment when gasoline prices have gone absolutely to the floor compared to where they were a year ago, and that these companies can go and hedge out a year's worth of gasoline.
No, but Tim, I just want to interrupt you. We actually pay our own gas. We control that.
Okay, so we pay our gas. And then even, I guess the question winds up being, what's the justification for a 20% increase? CPI is nowhere, and labor doesn't seem to be getting, 20% increases on a year-on-year basis.
Nobody paid their busing contracts, so now they're all like trying to recoup huge losses. And some of them, I mean, I don't know, like Valerie said, I think when you have this next wave of business loans, I don't know if that helps these companies. I'm not quite sure. I think, again, this is what we're hearing from them. I'm not in there. I don't know their books, but a lot of them are hurting. And I think they're trying to recoup. I think they're trying to recoup that cost, or maybe they're mad at us for not paying them. I don't know.
Yeah, no, that does make sense. And I guess the counter is simply that there's $350 billion that's already been done, and there's going to be more done for this Paycheck Protection Program. And I just sort of plant the seed now. It's like, at a 20% increase, it strikes me, particularly if they're hitting other districts with the same thing, that this is something that you want to bring to the attention of our Westchester County Attorney General or whatever his role is. But it just seems to me, while we're all sitting here dealing with this, there are federal programs that are being put in place for the benefit of companies that shouldn't be getting, it's effectively, when I hear 20%, it sounds like gouging. So I'll just plant that seed that if we get to this point where that's where they come back with, I think the question is whether or not that does constitute gouging to other districts. And it's something that we try to litigate.
Well,
And
what
of
Maureen and
course-
I also learned, Tim, is that there's a powerful lobby. Transportation is a very powerful lobby in Albany.
Right.
And, there was recently some data collected. The school districts had to provide, and Maureen was the one who completed the survey. Maureen, could you report on what we had to, share with
Yeah.
the state?
Yeah, so it was very interesting, and we found out what like Valerie said, the transportation lobby, the transportation lobby, it's not just like the local bus companies, it's MTA, it's the Beeline bus service, it's all the, major, they represent, because they hadn't always been unionized, but all the little bus companies, everything's unionized. And anyway, like Valerie said, they have a lobby. So we got had a request to, say when did we pay people? When did we stop paying people? Were we planning on paying, meaning our bus companies, and the amount that we weren't paying them? And they were collecting all this information. Then that was from the state is looking for, they wanted all the districts to report. And like I had mentioned, there's many districts, not all, and not necessarily in our carrier, but many districts have in fact paid their bus contracts. They've just said, we're paying them. And we technically could have, but that's where we're getting that savings. And many of them they wanted to extend their contracts when they paid them. So what we found out was that there's a huge lobbying effort going on at the state level to make districts pay what we owe them. So in other words, that savings that we've been talking about, and there's a chance. So I think to your point, as much as I hear you and we've had those conversations, like it feels like price gouging. I said that prior to this, like the last contract, that's how I kind of felt. But I do believe, I think that transportation is an extremely expensive operation to run. Their insurance is, astronomical. Their requirements to have new buses and the fleet, what they have to invest in it. And as much as I'm not saying I agree with the price increases, I do think, they are in business to turn a profit. And, they do have to I'm kind of happy to think that, part of the increases we've seen is because drivers are actually finally getting paid some decent wages. The people who are entrusted with driving children I do think are finally getting paid a little bit better than they were 5 or 8 years ago. The increases of minimum wage for all, I'm just saying, so I think some of that.
Let's not go there because that's
Right.
all well and good, but it's 20% is being discussed against our taxpayers, right? So I'm gonna.
No, I understand that. All I'm saying is if we go to the county executive, we actually were paying some of the lower in the county. We actually have one of the best contracts. All I'm saying is we could do that. I don't know what all the, particulars are, but I think companies are allowed to, rebid. And again, it would be consistent. The reason I say 20%, Tim, is because that's when we look at what other people in Westchester are paying, the 20% represents what other people are paying for their per bus for their out of district. It's not that I think that they're doing it to just a random number. They're going to look at that information, like what is Harrison paying for a bus? What is, what are all these districts?
Right.
What is Eastchester? That's where the 20% comes from.
I get it. I think in the interest of time, let's keep motoring. I think we all get it. I think that I think there's maybe some interesting things here to tinker with. And as a board, I don't think it's tonight's business. So let's keep motoring, but thank you.
Yeah, let's keep going. Thanks, guys.
So again, I don't
Were
know
there
if
some
you
more
want to jump
slides?
into. I mean, I added a couple more slides, but we can use this when we're talking about more, if we have savings this year. And the reason for this, it's really important not to lose sight of how things look over not only next year, but, what the impact of decisions we make today, what they will be on the following year, meaning in terms of, how much fund balance to use, do we levy to the limit? Do we not levy to the limit? What would the obvious pros of doing or reducing people's taxes would be that next year you could potentially use that money to reduce people's taxes. The issue, and this is what we've always struggled with, is then what is the following year going to look like? And that would be slide 51, Janine. And, it's, I don't know if this is helpful and people can look at it, ask questions, but what we're currently proposing, and again, this is a mock-up, it may not, it's right within a few dollars of the budget because I was adjusting these numbers just like literally at 4:30 today to kind of, so we could have this discussion as we talk about, we have some money left over this year, people, we're going into a really difficult time. Do we use some of that money to lower people's taxes? I think that's a legitimate thing to consider. But I think the problem with doing that in a tax cap environment is that whatever monies you use to either out of that extra money that we have available from, not paying busing and more than likely not having sports and some of the other things that would have traditionally been occurring, those monies are one-time savings. Like, unless, we go into this next year again, this is an extremely unusual event. This is additional monies up and above that, we would ever have this type of savings in our budget. If you were to take that money and just use it as a one-time restoration of things, the following year that money goes away. And then, what you find yourself, and this is to demonstrate why I'm trying to kind of show you, if you look at the 21-22 projections, if in fact, and this is just using what we're currently proposing to use in terms of appropriated balances, even this is demonstrating that with a reduction, and those appropriated balances come from expenditure and revenue, additional revenues, and expenditure savings. We're showing you a very tight budget next year. I think I know Tim and everyone in the board has been really mulling over the details of those numbers and asking a lot of really detailed questions. And we really, I think we're trying to demonstrate those numbers are pretty tight for next year. Right now, next year, I can't imagine we're going to generate anywhere close to that 1.4 million. And again, this is prior to the COVID savings. Just by having less money next year, you'll see that it's going to be necessary to stay within the tax cap to cut an additional $1.2 million out of next year's budget to stay within the tax cap. And again, this is based on what we're assuming. I'm not even cutting the revenues for the state really significantly. I'm just assuming that 5% reduction, which is actually fairly optimistic. If in fact you were to put more money in that appropriated balance this year and lower that property tax rate, that shortfall next year basically doubles, because you don't have, when you appropriate money, it's a revenue source. When you don't have that revenue source, you have to make it up in either taxes or reductions the following year. So I think it's really difficult. And this is part of why this is occurring now, is because we're in this tax cap environment. Years ago, you could appropriate it, but then if the following year you had to increase a little bit more over the tax cap, you could. And I mean, certainly we can, but I don't think many people would vote for a budget that exceeds the state mandated tax cap in a financial recession, So I think as we think about what the future years are going to hold, we have to be really thoughtful about any savings we have this year. And, what we may want to consider is, like Valerie said, if there was any type of restoration, I think you really have to be very, very mindful that, that is a one-time source of revenue to offset a reduction. And even with doing that, next year, we're going to have another challenging budget year, 21-22, even, regardless of that. So it's only going to make that deficit larger, because you've now you're not having the savings that we were hoping to have in that one year. And we're also not benefiting from, we're also using cash that then will diminish our reserves. So I think we need to really, as we think about, I know there's some people that there is a reason to be thoughtful about, what people's taxes are going for. And I absolutely, understand that. But I think we do have to look at it in the context of like our 2 to 3 year, looking out, because I think if just to use it once, just to be clear, you will make a larger hole for 21-22. And that's, just something I think we should just kind of, as we're talking about the money, talking about some of the reductions we're proposing, just anything that we restore, that next year will, that it's not going away, that, we'll need to figure out how we're going to balance it in the following year.
Let me just pause there a second. Does anyone on the board have questions about that? I know there's some newer members who maybe haven't, had to look at a tax cap and understand the implications of, what that looks in knock-on years, and also using reserve funds and the challenge with using one-time cash sources to fund ongoing budget items. Is everyone, any questions from this that come up? If you don't have any now, that's okay.
No, I think,
let's
no,
make-
I think that, Doug, it makes sense to continue to some line item discussion and spend a little bit of time drilling into some of the programmatic things that people feel strongly about, and then maybe circle back to the, if we have time, circle back to reserve regeneration and the importance of it.
Yeah, I think that, and I think, you know, that could also come up in the context of talking about some of these line items as well. So I think that that's certainly a way to go. And as people have a chance to look through these projections and ask questions, it may also take longer than tonight. So let's do that. Maureen, were there any more slides, or I'd like to jump into some specific
No, that was fine. And
conversations
again,
here.
I only,
Okay.
these were the sort of things that people have brought up. So I was trying to kind of put some slides together because I think there's been some conversation, like you said, with the board members reaching out to Valerie and I individually and talking about different things people that have been on their mind. So no, we can open it up to questions. That was it for now.
Thank
Okay.
you, Maureen.
So, yeah, thanks, Maureen. This was really helpful trying to create this context for the board and for the public. So I'd love to jump into a conversation about some of the topics that are facing either cuts or increases, or, and you know, I want to jump in to one of the bigger cuts that happened after the March 2nd, which was the proposed music cut. And I also want to just pause now and thank the administrators, the principals, and everyone else who had to go back after March 2nd and in an environment where you were already looking to make cuts and make further cuts. And you know, the second set of cuts is always going to hurt a lot more than the first. And one of those was the music position. And I know the board has received probably, if not 100, close to 100 emails. I think board members have likely spoken to a variety of people around town on the topic as well. So I just want to open up the conversation around the music position right now.
Hey, Doug, can I just say one thing before we open up to that, which is I don't think that I can, and I'm going to take the liberty of speaking for the board here and just reiterating the point you made. I don't think I can understate the level of appreciation that the building principals and other department heads have made, the effort that they've gone to reduce this budget. And I think what people listening into the call and anyone in the community really needs to understand as we go forward is that our building leaders are looking well beyond tomorrow and looking at the financial realities of the district and bending over backwards to make this work. So just the more time I've spent with this budget, the more I appreciate the efforts that the building leaders are making in meeting the challenges that Maureen and Valerie are putting to them. So I know I'm beating it maybe and now a dead horse, but you just can't underestimate the effort that's going into making this work and recognizing that 21-22 could be even harder than this. So thank you, and I'll cede the floor back to you to get going on this music position.
And we left out Jesse, Jeanette, Laura, and Tesfa. They're very important in the reduction. I mean, their work is also represented here. So I agree with you, the building leaders, but the entire leadership team.
Department heads as well.
Yeah,
correct. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you to everyone. I know this has not been an easy month on many levels for everyone, so thank you. So let's just jump into the music conversation. Does anyone on the board have some thoughts they want to share on the topic? I certainly have some thoughts. I'm sure Tim has some thoughts. We've been speaking a little bit more. Would love to pass it over to anyone that has thoughts on the position.
I'm happy to jump in. I wanted to thank people also for their letters and outpouring of suggestions and ideas. Where I am right now is a little bit torn based on what Maureen has expressed about what keeping a position means year over year. At the same time, from speaking to parents and actually a lot of children, it seems like Mr. Day has a value added beyond just the financial piece, that people really feel that in this short time they had him, I mean, only 5 months or so, that he made such a difference. And it feels like an extenuating circumstance given his impact. And that it may be worth our while when you find a gem to really hang on to that, because that person, because it doesn't always happen. And it's a special hire. So that's how I'm leaning. I do understand that means we have to look for further efficiencies next year, and, you know, call up schedules and look at, you know, the balance of loads and all of that. And that's a lot of intense work. And it's tricky. So, you know, and then look at other things, continue to look at other things as well, which have already, as we can see from Maureen's slides, have already been greatly reduced. So I see the challenge ahead, but that's my feeling about Mr. Day at this point. It's hard to remove him from the decision for me.
I want to, can you hear me? Yeah. I also want to just jump in and thank Maureen for all the work you put into this. I've been through this with you many times. We had a tough time, I don't know, back in 2008. And it's sometimes amazing to me the way that you could think about all these things and come up with ideas. So I want to thank you. But in terms of the music, I have felt very compelled by a lot of the letters that we've gotten, and I know what this community is like, and I know when something means something, people show up, people stand up, people write letters. And I particularly like it when people write their own letter and don't just take the letter that was sent to them, that they sent to us. But I think the thing that has come through to me over and over is the decision that we made a year ago when we hired him, but also in terms of the district that we are and the way that we value the arts and music. And that really is, I think, a very defining piece of this district. And I've thought about it a lot, and this is a hard thing to say, but I would have a hard time supporting a budget that included cutting that position. So.
Thank you, Jody. I agree with you and with the points that Allison has already made. I think our board, while we had a different makeup last year, the Board of Education made a commitment to our community a year ago to keep that department as robustly staffed as the community felt was appropriate. And I think it's incumbent upon us to be creative in creating a solution financially to make that possible. I particularly found it ironic that one of the suggestions was to bolster an unemployment fund should we need one in the future when we were talking about reducing this position. So I know that there are some additional monies that are available because of certain things that aren't being spent upon with the school closure. And my hope is that we can be creative in attributing some of those to keeping his position as part of the staff of our music department.
Yeah, all I can do is second the last three comments, 100%, 101%. Is that possible?
I'll jump in. I agree. I don't think it's, there's two things. One, I didn't make the decision that I made in terms of that we should keep the commitment to this position because of letters that came in. I think it's tremendous. We saw it last year with the passion, but I hope people don't get the sense that we make decisions based on the number of letters that come in, because I know that for myself, I definitely do not. I've talked to a lot of people about that, and we're getting letters about a lot of other positions and that are not going to be saved. And so getting letters is great, and I really appreciate it. But I just want to throw it out there that is not why I'm committed to this position. I'm committed to it because we made the commitment last year to the position. I also want to say that I really feel bad that Mr. Day's name got kind of thrown into this, because this was never about Mr. Day. It's about the role. And I think actually a lot of the role was actually in Hillside, where he doesn't even teach, but because we have this notion of the last in, first out, his name got swept into this. And so it's in a way great for him, because he's a first-year teacher, and it's very obvious that he's resonating very well, and people really like him. And I'm excited to see what he does in the future. But I really feel bad that his name has gotten caught in this as if this was something personal about Mr. Day. This has nothing to do with Mr. Day. So those two things are really important. Net, I still think we need a commitment to this position. We know how important the role was last year, and we made a commitment to it, and I still think we should stick with it. I do have a couple questions for Valerie and Maureen, because I've heard a lot about the schedules being maxed out, but I haven't really been able to get a sense of whether that's actually accurate. So just wondering, has there been whether it's music or other positions, because I see that sort of jockeying of, are we maxed out on the schedule? We had the master scheduler come, our schedule's full, and maybe that can be a discussion that we can have at some point to dive into, what the reality is of these schedules, because it becomes really complicated when I start hearing about, some teachers are doing lessons, some teachers are doing, this many classes, and so that's something that I sort of want to throw out there, whether we talk about it now or we table it till later. But those are my thoughts.
Do you want me to answer that, or do you want us to wait?
Let's just finish this conversation, and then, because I think that's a broader conversation that's much bigger than just music. So let's come back to that one. Sylvia, is there anything?
For a second, and just because of timing, Jeremy, I appreciate your comments, and I agree with you in terms of that it's not about Mr. Day, and also I didn't really mean to say that if people write enough letters that affects us. It was more that I meant that I was compelled by some of it. It made me think a lot about how we think about the district and our budget and what our values are. But I appreciate your point, because you're right, and we do get lots of other letters about a lot of things in this budget. And I didn't in any way want to imply that that's the trick that people need to do, is flood us with letters. So thanks.
Sylvia, is there anything you wanted to share on the topic, or no? You don't have to. I just want to open it up if you do.
I guess my thoughts on the matter are just that I want to overtly express how heavily this decision weighs, not only on myself, but amongst all the other members of the Board of Education. And I think, when I consider what a compelling position it is and how important it has been to the community, obviously historically, and even in this brief time for the duration of this year. The other thing is that what weighs upon us anytime, and particularly when it's occupied by somebody as compelling as, the individual who occupies it now, and the positivity that's been expressed for that person, we also weigh that against the very real obligation that we have towards the community to be accountable in terms of the expenses that we weigh. So, I mean, for myself, I'm obviously feel this is very compelling, and I've expressed to my colleagues, prior to tonight, that I would certainly support retaining the position. But I did do that. I did come to that decision after struggling mightily with it, because I think that oftentimes people who don't necessarily have all the specifics of the budget aren't confronted with really how much heart and soul the administration and Maureen in particular really pour into generating these figures. And that's a really tough place to be, because any position that we retain or any expense that we take on, it's going to be made up somewhere else. And that's a reality. So again, I have already shared with my board colleagues that I support retaining this position, but I also understand the repercussions that come along with that. And I think that while, depending on how this budget plays out, if people are pleased with the fact that we're able to maintain that position, similarly, other constituencies of folks are, will be unhappy about cuts that have to be made in a different area. And that's just the reality. So I'm not saying this from a place of it's an easy decision to make. It is not. So that's all I have to say.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, and I would echo what everyone has said. I will say the letters, do make an impact, but and I will say that not having a child who's had, Mr. Day, they were extremely moving and extremely. He sounds like an extremely compelling teacher, and that's just really wonderful to hear. And I think on that whole voice, having a voice, the thing sometimes the board often struggles with is there's a lot of people where the money is really important that don't have as much of a voice and don't share and don't have a 150, 200 person contingent that can come to their rescue. And so that's another thing, I think, and perhaps one of the things Jeremy was getting at. Sometimes really important things have a strong voice, and sometimes really important things don't have a strong voice, and we really try to keep our ears open for both of those. But in this case, it seems like the direction's clear, and so to Valerie and Maureen, if you can go back and look at the next version of the budget, let's ensure that music position is in it, and we'll keep moving from there. I do think that the idea that there is still some money under the tax cap, although obviously going up to the tax cap in an environment that we're in is tough. At the same time, it's about at a 0.81% increase in taxes right now, so it is not as high as it's been in years past. But again, weighing lots of pros and cons. Let's look at a next budget with the music person in it, with that music position in it. I'd like to move on to another conversation. I know that we've received a fair amount of letters as well around world language, to stop and talk a little bit about that position, and that may also open up a broader conversation that Jeremy just teed up with regards to just looking at schedules and scheduling and how that's occurring. Does anyone on the board have some thoughts they want to share around the language proposed? I wouldn't call it a cut, but a not rehiring right now.
Yeah. I'd love to jump in on this because I've thought about it. I don't have the details. It dovetails really perfectly with the issue that Jeremy just raised in terms of full utilization of teachers, et cetera. And let me just kind of lay out my starting point, which is I don't want to see fifth grade world language go. Just looking at other districts, I recognize that two of our neighbors appear to maintain something very similar. That would be Dobbs Ferry and Irvington. Two of our neighbors don't and have language start either in 6th or 7th grade. That'd be Edgemont and Ardsley. I think what that does is it kind of nicely demonstrates that maybe sometimes it's really not just about what are our neighbors doing, but in fact, what's good academically. Now, I'm going to go so far as to say I'm basing the strength of my conviction around a sample set of 2. That would be my 2 kids, one in 7th grade, one in 4th grade. The 7th graders taking Spanish, the 4th graders going through FLES. We're not a particularly language savvy family. I'm absolutely horrible at foreign languages, and my wife is not as good as she thinks she is. The kids are really, I think, thriving under the Hastings language program. So my son in this distance learning that we're all experiencing is working on a Spanish project. His 7th grade sister is excited to take the opportunity to try to teach him. What I'm seeing is their minds working in a different way from their other studies. Extrapolating that forward, I do not, while I can appreciate the cost savings and I stand by and support the removal of FLES in the elementary, and I will look to and hope the board will look to Amy Kazis continuing to push for the cultural enrichment that the FLES classes provide to students and finding other ways to do that. I cannot comfortably say I accept giving up on language education until 6th grade. I want to see these kids continue in 5th grade. You get the opportunity to leave schools. You feel like you're in middle school, even if you don't rotate. And when you get to middle school, you get foreign language in Hastings. That's my first point. So I feel very strongly about that. My second point is, okay, I want to figure out a way where we don't replace this retirement, and yet we manage to figure out world language, even if it's tweaked to some degree in amount of hours per cycle for the kids. But we manage to figure out a way to utilize the remaining, I believe there are 6 foreign language teachers. You have to correct me on the exact number, but we figure out a way to maintain this 5th grade world language with the existing resources. This jumps to the final point that I want to make in terms of utilization. So my understanding is you have foreign language teachers either teaching an AIS class. I believe one is called like an organizational skills class that is a small number of students, potentially teaching AOK. I've not looked at their full schedules. I want to figure out a way where other teachers that are maybe have gaps in there or space in their schedules can take on these responsibilities to free up the foreign language teachers to continue 5th grade world language. So it's utilizing foreign language just for foreign language, finding somewhere else across the other disciplines to fill these other classes. And I'll give a concrete proposal that I want the board to think about. In terms of ways to maybe go about making this happen. With Ms. Bertacci's retirement, we lose the department head. We will have a new department head. Department heads don't have a birthright to release time for planning. Whoever takes over the department head role for Spanish can actually give up release time, get a stipend for department head. Maybe it's a slightly larger stipend than the existing department heads if we can't contractually change existing department heads' role. But we can certainly do it on a going forward basis. But right there, you would get 0.2 FTE in the department, where that department head, relative to the leaving department head, would be teaching more. We've already just freed up some opportunity for some other teacher to teach 5th grade world language. So where you can see from my comments, there's 3 parts. I feel strongly 5th grade world language in Hastings is important. Part 2, I think we need to figure out a way to do with the remaining teachers that will be in the department. Part 3, there are ways that I believe there are ways that we can figure this out. One concrete example is the new department head for foreign language, giving up release time, and then having that work throughout the full department to free up the lower teachers for this 5th grade world language. And I'm sure there are other small adjustments, but all I can say is I can't vote for this budget with 5th grade world language leaving. Those are my points.
Tim, can you clarify just the idea I can't vote for this budget with 5th grade world language leaving? So essentially, are you saying you could potentially vote for the budget if that position is not filled, but if there's a commitment to 5th grade world language with some creative
100%.
ideas,
Absolutely
one of
right.
which is
Absolutely.
this point to FT? Okay.
Absolutely right. So I need to be able to say to our community that yes, we did not replace this staff member. It was the right decision, both in terms of the size of the department and the right decision for the budget, but most importantly, right decision for the size of the department. But for that to be right, we have to be able to preserve this 5th grade world language program with existing staff. So it's really, and I kind of push this back to the administration, and this will fall on, Chris with Gail's departure, and it will fall on Lou, and it will fall on Valerie, and it will fall on Melissa to put their heads together and look at schedules and say, okay, how are we going to make this work? And my one suggestion around this topic, like I said, is let's just have whoever takes over department head, they don't have release time in language. And right there, you pick up point 2.
Do you want us to comment now?
Let's pause there because I think Tim, you're opening up a bigger set of questions, the ones that we put a pin in about half an hour ago, which was this idea of just a broader set of scheduling questions. Why don't Valerie, you and Melissa and perhaps Maureen or whoever's got some insights on this, perhaps some of the principals jump in and just give us some thoughts on that topic.
Sure. I'll start with the last point that Tim made. That has to be negotiated with the Hastings Teachers Association. We're changing the contract by, taking the, or hiring the next department head outside of the current contract language. So that one, is not as easy as you think. So we have to give something back to get that out. So just know that. So I just wanted to clarify that because that one is almost, that one requires a whole lot more than, the conversation we're having. So that was one.
Yeah, that's hard.
I think it's absolutely important for us to look at the whole schedule, similar to the points that other board members have made. It's unfair to have, this contract center around music education. And therefore, have one, teacher's name mentioned. Because this is a bigger issue, across the entire, program and across 3 schools. And it does require, as you're asking, for us to go back and take a look at places where we can tighten our belts. And we can, and I think doing that now will help us next year because we're going to have a new set of problems. But I do want us to, it would be best to find any kind of additional savings in that direction rather than going back and taking, something out of other, budget codes, because that's, at this point, the budget managers went as far as they could, and again, with the caveat that they would not, their decisions would not increase class sizes. So it would, additional savings would come from now looking at every schedule in every department to make sure, if I understand you correctly, so correct me if I'm wrong, looking at every schedule in every school, in every department, or each school, and also looking at if those schedules have gaps in them and are not full. Is that what you're asking us to do?
That's 100%. Right. I mean, I think part of, while it's potentially getting into the nitty-gritty, I do think part of our responsibility here is to try to provide at least some of what we see at the board level as places to start. And that's where the negotiating way, the release time for the new department head, their idea comes from. I certainly respect 100%, and was thinking about it even as I was saying it, that it is a negotiated issue with the HTA. but we get into this issue of looking at exactly what classes the existing foreign language teachers are teaching, looking at where can they give up certain classes to just focus in foreign language to preserve what I think is an important course offering, and how can we cover those classes with other individuals, and what does that take? Take AOK classes, for example. Does it take some kind of stipend? So it does have an economic effect, but it's not a full FTE. It's a very, very different economic effect. So I just want to be, I want to, at least speaking for one trustee, I want to set, like you said, Valerie, you and Melissa and the building leaders off in that direction, because I'd really like to hear back, in the next, it's probably not, the next days, but certainly in the next weeks, I would like to hear back that, yes, we firmly believe that we can maintain this world language even without replacing Nora's retirement.
Right. And one other point, just as a point of clarification, Tim, you mentioned AIS, and I don't know if, those, members of the community know that AIS means Academic Intervention Services. So were you suggesting, Tim, that we take the AIS out of potentially the world language to restore the 5th grade world language teacher or the program to remove AIS from the schedule?
No, so what it is, and again, this is where, just sort of trying to understand what the foreign language teacher's course load looks like. And this is where, certainly just more information to the board and different proposals and ways to go about it would have to be looked into by you and Melissa and others, and then shared with us. My understanding is that you have foreign language teachers also providing, an AIS-like class, so organizational skills class, right? And so now that's a class. Can that class be covered by someone else from some other department? It's not a foreign language specific class, right? So it's not a removal of AIS from the foreign language department by any means.
It's about who teaches it.
It's about who teaches it, correct.
Okay, and just so that you know, AIS is woven throughout the schedules in the middle and high school. So that's why, as you suggested earlier, that we have to look at every department, because a change in one department or an inquiry in one department means we have to fairly look at every other department, so that again we're treating people fairly. And I wouldn't want any department, as you wouldn't want any department to feel as though they're targeted. So that's why I'm
100%.
trying to clarify
100%.
exactly what you're asking us to do, because that would be the fair thing to do.
Correct, 100%. And it winds up having, look, it's not a panacea and it can have knock-on effects, but we've had conversations before about running classes that have very few enrollees, right? So we may find that there's a class that, as desirable as that class is for a higher level class, a junior or senior level elective class, if the enrollment is X repeatedly, then maybe that class is offered once a year. That department covers the AIS, right? And then it basically rolls through. Somebody in that department covers the AIS by not having that low enrolled elective class across some department. And I'm not targeting any particular department, but just by having a low enrolled elective class in a department, working through the daisy chain frees up some FTE resource in that department to then teach the AIS, which allows that. You get my point.
Yes, I do. And one other thought, just so that you know, I know Maureen is reminded us of this. We really have to get close to a board adoption, a budget adoption. So our next meeting is next week. It was going to be a board meeting. Could I suggest that become a work session as well, and that, I'm speaking, if any budget manager wants to, suggest something different, but I would suggest that so that the budget managers are not placed on the spot tonight and may not be prepared to answer those questions. Could we have the time to organize all of this and do an analysis, with Maureen, Melissa, myself supporting, the budget managers, or I should say the building leadership teams, because that's where we're looking. Could we then present next Monday to, make a presentation on all of that information?
Yeah, I think the only question, I don't know that we would need to call it a work session. It could still be a board meeting. I don't know if there's, for example, budget items that need to be voted on and business that needs to be taken care of. And I think we could have a board meeting that just has at its core a large portion that's that's a budget essentially working session. So
okay.
Two areas that I think would be interesting to have in that research as well, Valerie, is I guess this would be more for the high school, but looking at study hall and the use of study hall and how many study halls and if there are any savings potentially in there. And then also the 245 to 315 period that is at the middle school and high school. Would that be an area where you could pull AIS into that period and utilize that better? Because I feel like that, I think I'd heard that was, or originally it was like classified as teaching time, but it's not really utilized. I know that, I don't know what percentage of students utilize it, but I know it's not 100%. And I don't know how many teachers. It seems like we have time there that we might be able to utilize better than it's being utilized today.
We can look at that because, as you know, there was a topic of a conversation this year because a side letter or an agreement was, made with the Hastings Teachers Association that if we ever fell short of time and to meet the 900 minutes for K6 and the 990 minutes for grade 7 through 12, that basically that time could we could take time from that time. So basically, I'm assuming that that this agreement did cover last year, so we've already engaged in that practice of considering that time to be instructional time, because some of that time was actually used last year. I mean, I'm not, I don't have the legal sort of, authority here to, make that pronouncement. But in response to your question, I think that, in conversation with the HTA, obviously, it would be, it would behoove us to take a look at that as a time that we can, presumably, look at why we can't offer AIS during that time spot, and also maintain the spirit of the that time, which is teachers can also attend meetings. And so and another point too with regards to AIS, and I referenced this earlier, I don't know if people realize what AIS is and how it typically operates, but academic intervention services are a mandate under the state testing program. So for the math and ELA test in grades 3 through 8, if a student doesn't meet a certain benchmark, and every year the state prescribes what that is. So there are cut points that that designate which on the basis of the score, a child's score, whether they actually are eligible for AIS services, and so we follow that. The other, and that also applies to the Regents exams that children take. So that's the criteria. And if students through the MTSS process are in danger of not being able to score a level 3 on these assessments, they would also be eligible for AIS services. So they're not services that every child needs, and the performance level of students in Hastings. They do very, very well, I think, in math and ELA. And Melissa Szymanski would know this because she's been very involved in the data. our students score the highest in the river towns, among the river towns, Rivertown districts in ELA and math. So, there should be based upon that, very little need for AIS. That's just I'm just drawing that, that conclusion just on the basis of that and what I learned this year. And likewise in the high school was awarded, was designated or recognized this year or last year, for being a high performing, school. So again, that would suggest that there, a great many students who are doing very well, as they march towards, completing all their Regents requirements. So I just wanted to, present that as a overview, just in case anyone, didn't have an understanding of what the purpose of AIS, is. Melissa, did you want to add anything?
I actually did want to go back and make one comment about world languages. So I think having the opportunity to go and take a look to see if
you go brush your teeth, honey.
Some of those scheduled opportunities can actually work in terms of being a particular.
Your nail?
Someone has to
hold
their
on.
mic, please.
Yeah, we just need the teeth brushing in silence. Thank you.
Yeah, we're hearing all the details about getting ready for bed.
So I think, having the opportunity to go back and collaborate around looking deeply into the schedules to see if someone could not do one thing like a study hall or whatever the case may be, and then go in and do the 5th grade world language. I just wanted to point out we're talking about Spanish and French, so there are certification pieces that'll come into play. And also, it will probably be unlikely that we'd be able to cull a 1.0 out of that, which raises questions around thinking programmatically about what that might look like. I will say that if you're talking about 2 different world languages and you're talking about a part of an FTE, that can become very, very challenging. Even if you're thinking about, hiring, for example, you're not the pool of candidates who would even want to be involved in something like that, if we weren't able to do that internally, would be very limited. So I just wanted to mention that.
Yeah, and I guess the point is just to come back to the board prior to this board meeting saying, this is these are the classes and the total FTE of the existing staff, not replacing Nora Bartacci's retirement, that we think that through redeployment of other resources in the buildings, there's this amount of FTEs available for a world language program. And then we can have a discussion, well, where might we find some other resources, et cetera. So we just need more information, but I certainly know what I want to see happen, which hopefully I articulated.
I also want to add something, that study hall is not part of a teacher's FTE. It's a duty that's assigned. So I don't think it works in that way in terms of filling the positions, teaching the courses, et cetera, when we think of the role that study hall could play in it.
The only thing I do know, we do use some of our permanent subs to do study halls. So there's a cost to us, but I know you're saying, Jody, that's a duty. I think it's more in the AIS and the scheduling of that, which is actually part of a load. But at the high school, study halls can be a duty in somebody's schedule. You're right.
I think,
there are ways that if you didn't have that as a duty, there's other things we backfill. So I guess it's just looking at what the duties are and if there's other opportunities to shift them to something that maybe we're spending money on, right? Some people may have lunch as a duty where we pay people to do lunch coverage.
Yeah,
so it may be also
contract.
Huh? Yeah, no, and I know what you're saying, but I know 2 instances where we actually pay people every day to be. I'm pretty sure, and I know Lou and Melissa on here, I'm pretty sure one of our or 2 of our permanent subs, for the most part, do study halls every day. So we do pay for that.
But Jody, just to the point that I was looking into, just when I did a little bit of digging into this world language program and the staffing of the existing foreign language teachers, I just want the administration to check are they doing AIS type classes that could potentially be covered by other departments? Are they doing AOK classes that could potentially be covered by other departments? What is their total total course load look like? And can we shift around some of the course load to free up sufficient amount of FTEs for fifth grade world language? And I hear your point, Melissa, which is we'll look at it and it still might not amount to a sufficient number to cover French and Spanish. And then let's talk about, what's the next thing? And can we negotiate with Nate to get the new department head to give us an additional 0.2? So I get that it's not easy. There's not the work is going to need to be done to figure out how many FTE we can pull out of this.
I guess the question in my mind is, there's a lot of moving parts, because I think what we're looking at is there's a number of elective, I know AIS is not elective, but some of the AOK is elective, and some of the French and Spanish, the world languages. I don't know if elective is really the right word, but it's obviously not kind of the core curriculum. It's things where there is play, and I think Hastings has been very good at offering up a lot of different opportunities for kids in a lot of different domains and areas. Courageous conversations and organizations skills stuff. It's a variety of different opportunities, and I think that considering fifth grade world language or any of those topics, because I can imagine a world in which we dig around and we find resources to support fifth grade world language without hiring another resource in the world language department, and that negatively impacts something else. Which isn't to say it's the wrong decision, but it's an impact decision. And I think where we're going to end up here, and certainly someone else jump in if you have a different thought on this. I think where we're going to end up here is is options.
Yes.
And no option is going to be a kind of cheery, feel good option for everyone. And Tim, you shared your story about your kids, and they like fifth grade world language, and I've got a kid going into fifth grade next year. I'd certainly love to see him have that. At the same time, I want to be looking at this from a holistic resource perspective, so that we so that we can, as a board, can make those trade-offs. And that's something that I in asking this, I'm not exactly even sure what I'm asking, because I'm not sure who's got what skills and how that actually can occur. But it seems as though, and I know there are some people who have foreign language skills and certifications who are teaching other classes who can be switched over to teaching that, and that would work. And then what I just don't know is, what is the negative impact? Are these classes where they're kind of undersubscribed and there's 4 kids, or are these really popular classes? One of the things that really does jump out at me, at that new slide that Maureen added to this deck, how do we compare with other districts, is we have, kind of middle of the pack, actually, kind of middle to middle lower of the pack, teacher actual salaries. If you look at, and what that first data point is really pointing at, Hastings ranked 31 out of 52 districts in total teacher salary. That's an individual teacher over the course of a 25-year career, on average, we're 31 out of 52. So that's an average over the course of a career. And then you jump down 4 or 5 bullets, and we're number 3 out of 48 in instructional spending. And Tim, I know this is a point you keyed in on when you saw this at the Budget 101 meeting back in January. What does that mean? Those 2 data points taken together means we have more teachers per student than a lot of districts. And so we've made decisions to invest in a lot of different offerings, and in many ways it's one of our strengths, and we like that. And on the other hand, it's really expensive, and I think we have to ask hard questions about where is it that something is a fascinating course, but it's undersubscribed, and we've got a teacher teaching 4 kids, 5 kids, 6 kids. And, you know, if it turns out that we've got a few of those, and, you know, reallocating some of those resources to, for example, a 5th grade world language, which would have a much higher, you know, number of students in it, it seems like it makes a lot of sense. But I don't have those numbers, and I don't know that we're going to be able to kind of go through it here. But I'll throw that over to Maureen and Valerie and Melissa to see if there's, you know, any sort of set of options that you can provide in the coming week that would provide us with some choices, so it's not a binary, you know, kind of, you know, 5th grade world language in or out. We also haven't brought up FLES, and that's just another thing. You happen to pick up 5th grade world language, and one of them may be possible, one might not be possible. You know, I don't know. But, you know, there's just a lot of different iterations in doing this without making that higher. So let me just stop there. There's a lot of considerations without making the higher. There's another point we haven't actually come to as a board, though, which is where do we feel about that hire, about making the hire? And you know, Tim, you had kind of an assumptive position on that, which is you know, to not make the hire. And I just want to open up to the rest of the board in case someone else has a different point of view or position around, you know, that hire. Obviously, if we did that, it would create a need to find money somewhere, you know, under a rock somewhere. But I just want to make sure that we're kind of aligned or not aligned on that before we move forward on the other point.
I don't know how many classes the teacher who's retiring covers. Is it 4 classes that we need to be picked up, or, you know?
Well, it's 4. It's 4, but she's a chairperson, so that's kind of what Tim was saying, that like right now, like there would be 4, but if someone else were to become the chairperson, it's always going to be 4. And I think that's why I get where Tim's line of thinking is that right now, based upon that, the assumption is that the FTE needed to run the 5th grade exploratory language is somewhere in that 0.8 range. I think, you know, it has to be, because if we're eliminating that to offset the hire at the high school, that's what the, in fact, need is to run that program. So that would be what needed to be backfilled, right? I mean, that actually, I heard that before. It has to be 0.8 because that's what they would be losing if we didn't make the hire.
And I also want to just take us back to the beginning. You know, we'll get our first assessment from the state, which is the amount of the reduction on April 30th. I would strongly suggest that we hold off on any other restoration until we know what that amount is, so that we go into the decisions fully aware of what we can anticipate, you know, after April 30th. Because I'm really worried about these 3 assessments and other bad news that we're going to get. And you know, before long, we'll be looking at other things that, you know, other people value, and you know, and the bottom line is none of us want to make these decisions, but we also need to hold to knowing that we have to build a reserve in anticipation of 3 assessments and other reductions that are going to impact us. And you know, and the last thing I want to do is make a reduction in, you know, FTE in December because we get, you know, the notification from the state is that there's an amount, you know, that exceeds our reserves. So I just want you to keep in mind all of that as you think about, you know, the options. And I think what's really important is being able to go back with the budget managers and look at the schedules of every department. And from there, make some decisions, because, you know, on one of the earlier slides, one of the things we talked about was, you know, could we come up with a percentage or a dollar amount over the course of 5 years that, you know, would help offset, you know, the costs that are going to increase every year, the cost of living increases every year, that would be palatable to the public. That was bullet number 1. The second one had to do with finding efficiencies in, you know, our current, you know, schedules. and how we use resources. So I think that's very valuable to focus on that second bullet. And I think this conversation is leading us there. And I think that's the most fruitful pathway to take if in fact, this conversation is about the restoration of grade 5 world language.
That makes sense to me. I think it's hard to think about this without seeing all of those puzzle pieces with different options.
Yeah, I mean, I can share. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead, Lauren.
I was just going to say that, these were conversations pre-budget that the board has been talking about with the administration in terms of efficiencies. And we did bring in the master scheduler as a first step in this process. And it seems that we've had to put the gas pedal all the way to the floor with the current pandemic to figure out this very complicated puzzle. And with new administration who's just learning the workings of our departments and the skill sets and certifications of our teachers. So I think, having more information would be helpful. And I do recognize that the process had been started and recognize the challenge to make it go faster and the necessity to make it go faster under the circumstances. And just want to acknowledge that. And then separately, I think that where I'm standing now is I'm having a hard time sort of authorizing hiring a new position with all of the economic uncertainty that we have. We have other positions within the districts that we've been notified of retirement, not teaching positions, but staff positions that we've reallocated staff members to do different administrative jobs to take on those retirements. So I'm uncertain at this point how I feel, but I think having more information would be helpful.
Yeah, I'll just say that I'm in the same place as Lauren. I think in a world where a lot of people are feeling a lot of financial pain, the fact that no one's actually losing their job here, I think, is really important. And so if we have an opportunity to save money in a way where no one loses their job, I think we have to take it. And I will say, for me, that does not necessarily indicate anything about a commitment to the world language program. And I think those two can get conflated, and I think it's important that they don't. We can find out certain things later in the year that the cuts weren't as bad. We can find out we've got reductions somewhere else that are under the tax cap, that we can continue to have those conversations. And I want to make sure that the conversation to not hire this position, and this is where I'm personally standing right now, doesn't get conflated with a degree of commitment to a really robust and proper world language program, because they're two different things in my mind.
Yeah, and I hear you. I just would counter by saying history suggests that when things get cut out, they don't get added back. We can probably look at various various offerings in this school and other schools that when things leave, it takes a long time to come back. And so where I stand on this, I think it's very clear from the last 30-minute discussion around the work that Valerie and Melissa and department heads are going to do in terms of looking at, okay, this is a 0.8 position. Where is it possible to find 0.8 with a rejiggering of resources? If it's not possible to find 0.8, is it possible to find 0.6? Is there a capable program that can be put forward with a 0.6? I want to hear, to your point before, Doug, all options available with working within the existing resources that entails not replacing this position. I want to hear a detailed explanation that I think we collectively as a board can get our minds around what is and isn't possible and what are the sacrifices that come with what's possible, and then make a comment around the position or not, and this position versus other positions. So unfortunately, I know these things take time, but That's how I approach this.
One
I
other
wanna
question.
I want to do a check-in here, but before, so Valerie, you've got some stuff around the request. Does anyone else want to make a point around the world language stuff? And then I want to come back to the requests, questions from Valerie and possibly Melissa and Maureen as they're putting some thoughts around these options together.
No,
Okay.
so I think we understand. I think, you know, we're looking at it comprehensively, right, Valerie? We're going to be bringing everything back across the board.
Yeah, we are. And the one thing that I wanted to respond to, which I realized I hadn't as I looked at my notes, is there were some questions about the master scheduler who came in and worked in the middle school and at Hillside. I know Gail and Chris are on. I think it would be important to hear from them, what changes that we can expect to see in next year's schedule that responds to some of the concerns, about the amount of contact time on a daily basis, as well as some concerns around equity and the ability for students who have received mandated services to be able to access other options in the middle school that are available to other students, but are not necessarily easily available to students with mandated services because they're currently scheduled concurrent to when the mandated service was offered. So I think it would be important to hear at least a little bit of summary, and that we did plan to report back to the board. So I don't want this to be the full report, but maybe just a few comments about, especially since AOK has been brought up. And I know Elliot recommended a structure with regards to this intervention or a period where everything happens, whether it's lessons and, interventions and AIS and so forth. So if you could speak to that, that would be great. And then we'll have the full master schedule conversation in June.
Hi, sure. This is Gail. We were charged to ensure a few things. One, that we provided reading instruction and special education services to students on a daily basis, and that we were also to ensure that youngsters met daily for math and ELA. And on an 80-minute schedule, that didn't happen. So we reworked the schedule and came up with a 40-minute schedule. We worked with the special education director and assistant director and high school people. It required a tremendous amount of coordination with the elementary school and the high school. So our schedule now does ensure that reading instruction and students with special needs are served on a daily basis. We have a 9-period day, which is what we had actually years ago. And our youngsters will come in contact on a daily basis with all of their subject areas. We had to work with the high school with shared staff, so both buildings' schedule had to be restructured and worked on. So that's what I've got. I'm frozen. I don't know if people can hear me. I hope you hear me.
I can hear you, but I was miming because I was on mute. So yeah, so I think that that amount is adequate, Gail, unless the board, trustees have other questions about it, but it does require a much broader conversation so that you can actually see the schedule. So that's what Gail and Chris, Amy and John, and to the extent that Lou and Melissa need to also present. I think everybody needs to present their schedule so that we understand, what to anticipate next year. And I think that could certainly be, some of that can be brought into our next board meeting on April 27th. And some can't because the building leadership team is still working out certain details, because they're also making these reductions at the same time that they're trying to build the 2020, 2021 master schedules.
And I will say that we've so far had 4 iterations of the schedule. So it's continually a work in progress, again, based on all of the changes.
So as
So we
far
have
as,
our
go ahead, Valerie.
No, I was just saying, I'm just reiterating, we have our charge, and I'll just turn it over to Melissa, to follow up.
And I'll work with the building leadership teams and we will take a deeper look.
Okay. So I just want to do a time check where and share some other topics. I think I've gotten notes from board members that Lauren may have already actually taken off, and Tim, I believe, needs to leave. So we would be down to 5 board. Oh, you're still there. I can't get all the cameras to come up here. So, okay, there you are. And just want to do a time check. Let me throw out some other topics that I think we want to talk about, and figure out if we want to do that tonight or we want to continue this conversation next week. One is there have been questions about the bond, and in this current environment, how do we think about that? And so that one is maybe one not for tonight, but it's one wherein we're looking at a variety of different angles and options for that. And that's kind of evolving along. It doesn't have as much immediate impact on the current budget right now, but it could play in different ways. So that's one. The second one is just around special education. I know there have been program reviews done, and some of the recommendations for those program reviews. I know there have been questions from board members and people in the public. How are we going to ensure that the program review recommendations are covered, and people want to make sure that it's covered in the current budget. So that's another set of topics. And another one is the 5th grade play, and that's maybe a little bit of a smaller one, and we could maybe just tackle that tonight. There've also been questions from the public surrounding use of fund balances, where to do it, why to do it, where not to do it, why not to do it. And I know that Maureen has some thoughts, on that topic. I might suggest that one we come back to next week. So those were for the bond, special ed program reviews, and ensuring that recommendations are covered in the current budget, use of fund balances, and the 5th grade play. Are there any other, before we jump into any or none of those, are there any other big topics that the board members wanted to make sure we discussed?
I just want to understand what you mean exactly by special education program reviews and whether they're covered in the budget. Just elaborate. I want to just make sure I know exactly what you're talking about.
Valerie will go through more of it because I don't know the specifics, but I do know that there was a review done at FMS, and some of those some of the outcomes of those reviews are things that people close to the process had some questions about whether they'd be covered. And I know Valerie, working with Laura, Tespa, and Melissa, has thought through, in our current budget environment, how do we look at some of the things that came out of that program review. And I don't think, Valerie, we've not actually seen the outcome of that program review. Have we seen the detailed outcome?
We have not. What's happening now is the reviewer, Dr. Rufo of Inclusive Schooling, shared a draft with us, and we're actually reviewing it because I think there was something else that they may have needed from us. But so Tespa, Laura, Melissa, and I have to review this first, and then notify Dr. Rufo that everything here is accurately represented. and to the best of our ability. Like, certainly if it's data that we've shared with her, we want to make sure that that's correct. And then we would provide, present to the board first, and in terms of the report. So we'd have Dr. Rufo make a presentation to the board. At that point, we would also follow that up with a conversation with Farragut Middle School, just so that they are also aware and they can ask questions that that they may not feel comfortable asking during a board meeting, or we may not have enough time. And then the next step after the presenting to the board and to the middle school would be to to have a go-to or meeting with SEPTA and others, so that they could hear the report and ask questions and follow up. So that's and again, this program review focused on the instructional side of special education, and looking at certain areas and challenges or barriers that we've heard about from various parents who have children with IEPs. And this program review sought to discover what were the issues and how could we remedy those. So that's the broader context. And what I wanted to mention, and certainly Laura and Tesfa can jump in. One of the things that the three of us have been talking about, I mean the four, Melissa's been involved in this conversation as well, because there's a huge instructional component here, which was part of Dr. Katzman's report. Our continuum, and I shared some information with the board last Friday, our continuum, is missing two key models. One is a consultant teacher, whether it's direct or indirect, and a new model altogether that was recommended by Dr. Rufo called an inclusion facilitator, whose primary role, I mean, they can have a caseload, it's a special educator, but their primary role is to assist general education teachers in modifying assignments and lessons, and assessments. So that's very, very important. And the other component has to do with making sure that there's professional learning available for teachers, general educators, special educators, anyone who's working with students with IEPs, to assure that they are immersed in current research and practices. And that's certainly part of the program review report. And there's also, there are about 6 recommendations, and they're too extensive for us to get in. And I don't want to, I don't want to do them an injustice by sort of going through them quickly. And so it's important to hold off on those until we discuss those at the board, at a board meeting. But there's some very important steps that we can take to start a process of ensuring that we addressing the issues. Now we're hearing someone has a mic issue. I'm hearing a echo. Okay, so there are a couple of changes that we already started talking about, a few months ago, that will help us to establish the inclusion facilitator role with current staffing, and also increase our literacy support for not only for students with IEPs, but for any student that receives a mandated service, and any student who comes through the MTSS process, who is recommended for literacy services. So the proposal that we're making does address all of that.
Yeah, I just wanted to, without causing you to lose your train of thought, so freeze your train of thought so you don't lose it. I just want to understand how we're going to staff the inclusion facilitator under existing staffing.
Well, before we go down that path, because this may be a broader conversation, and certainly, I think that it certainly seems as though, from what you just said, Valerie, that there's that opportunity to fund that inside of the current staffing, right? So I think that's the high level takeaway. What that actually looks like, and maybe a broader conversation. And I don't want to go too far down this path. What I do want to check in on is, when is the appropriate time to have this conversation? Is it next week's board meeting? Is it, when I know there are, questions out there in the public about how some of these things will be delivered. And I just want to make sure we have an opportunity to look at it, holistically and have that conversation.
I hear you, but with all due respect, this is a budget work session, and everything about this work session is how we're funding positions. So, and I think the position makes sense, married to an educator who's worked in ICT classes. I think nothing you're saying about the position of an inclusion facilitator, like that resonates with me 100%. But we just finished a 30-minute conversation about not replacing world language. So I want to know how we're going to do this in current staffing.
Right.
But I just do really want to hold on though a second and just get a sense of where we are in time before we go anywhere. What time do we want to use this budget session until, and what else do we want to accomplish in this budget session? So let's just poll the board right now. Lauren, I think you've got to take off. Is that correct?
Things are holding steady in my camp for the time being, but
there's no screaming children yet. Okay. And Tim, do you have to take off in just a few minutes? Is that correct?
Same camp. Angry pound on the door have not yet occurred. So.
Okay. And so, I don't know, Valerie, what you think about how long this conversation would take, and if we want to try to do it, in the next half hour, at least to tee it up and tee up aspects of it. And there's a TBD, I guess, with the actual report and some of the insights that will come out. But does that make sense?
It makes sense.
Okay.
The foundation, as an answer to your question, Tim, the foundation of the sort of how do we fund this inclusion facilitator rests in a very important finding that Dr. Rufo made. Something that she calls overclustering of students with IEPs and inclusive programming. The continuum is so important. The continuum of special education services is so important. And Tessman and Laura can speak to this in just a second, but I just wanted to kind of, just because I've, had some experience in former districts with the special education program and program reviews and implementing those, with directors of special education is something that I have seen before. So overclustering means that, we're looking at, so the least restrictive, and Lauren Tess will correct me if I'm going down the wrong, hole here, but the least restrictive in this continuum is the consultant teacher model that I mentioned. The most restrictive, which led to this finding by Dr. Rufo, is this overclustering. So in an ICT classroom, you have, which is the most expensive model. And the reason it's the most expensive model is that you have two full-time teachers, a general educator and a special educator in a classroom, sometimes with the lowest ratio, that we have, anywhere, because that's, again, part of what's described in the continuum. This is all New York State law and IDEA compliance. And sometimes we have a teacher assistant or aide in that class. And what that does is further segregate students, and it's a misuse of certain resources, because some of those resources can be used to help really push forth the idea of inclusion and making sure that students with IEPs are spending time with their non-disabled peers, in general education settings. And one important sort of caveat to remember in all of this, that, special education is about general education. And Tessman and Laura have heard this as well, because they were a part of the Inclusion Institute at Syracuse University. So while this is a special education budget, this is to ensure that students with IEPs are, with a major goal, with all their unique needs, are spending time with their non-disabled peers in classroom settings, with the same expectations, obviously with the supports. So we've been focusing on the most restrictive and the most expensive end of the continuum. And that's something that's where the savings will eventually over time occur, but there's another shift that will answer your question, Tim, with regards to how we manage to create at least a portion of an inclusion facilitator for next year. And this is where Laura and Tespa should jump in.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
So
Okay.
I just wanted to start also, Valerie, just to add to the most restrictive is also the special class. So we have the ICT and then we have the special class. And I don't know if you remember, the board remembers, but we had special classes has one title, but it depends also on ratio. So we can have a special class of a ratio of 811, 812, 1211. There's all different ratios, but they're all fall under the cluster of special class, and that happens to be our most restrictive that we have in district right now. To speak to Jenna's recommendation, I think her main, again, there's several of them, and I think I agree with Valerie. It's important for you to hear and to have the time to go through all of them rather than just kind of summarize them. But I think one of the things that she's focusing on, to answer your question, Tim, is to redistribute our staffing so that we are providing a much more inclusive approach to special education, and that our children are not segregated, and that they are more included in with their general education peers, and they are getting access to the Common Core curriculum along with their peers, and that's really what the whole inclusion philosophy is about. Is it's not segregation, and it's enabling all children to have the opportunity to learn with their peers. And the tie into that is strengthening our special education and our general education staff and relooking at how we allocate our resources.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. It makes sense. I was just wondering, is there a reasonably concise mapping? This special education teacher from this grade is no longer going to teach this grade and go and become this inclusion facilitator, or is it's not that? It's not that, is it not that direct? Because that's really what I was looking for.
Sure. What we have been looking at, which is also through, a mandate from the state, is ensuring that, as Laura mentioned, the special class, when we have a special class, and what that means is that there's in a smaller setting, a special educator teaching, English to that small group of students, or social studies, science, or math. We, in certain cases, have not had, that teacher has not been certified to teach English, math, or social studies or science. And then there was one instance where that's real, that that person with there was a special educator teaching an English class, for example. We wouldn't, that's one of those equity issues, and we want to make sure that we are providing every opportunity for our students to, have access to, a teacher who did receive certification to teach in that particular area. So what that did, in combination with looking at Hillside, was it allows us to do the following. Because of a reduction in ICT in at Hillside, we have a position that we want to move to the middle school, and in doing so, this person happens to be special education and literacy certified. And that's a very important certification, because for one of the issues that we raised earlier, which is making sure that students with IEPs who need literacy services have access to those services, as well as other students who have mandated services, and any other student who may be recommended because they are, at risk, or identified through the MTSS process. So an additional special educator with a literacy certification comes up, and she's bringing more literacy services with her. The teacher the special educator who's formally taught an English class won't be teaching that English class. And so what that allows us to do, because this is a very experienced, very knowledgeable, skilled educator, special educator, this special educator who also has a literacy certification, could spend part of her time offering literacy services along with the other special educators. So literacy services would be covered. And part of that person's time, one of the most experienced special educators, part of that time would be dedicated to serving as the inclusion facilitator. Now, of course, that is not a full-time part of that person's role because, you know, we're mindful of FTE, and obviously we don't want to increase FTE. And so what that does for us is it provides us with, you know, twice the literacy services. So there's 2 people there certified, you know, with you know, a lot of experience and knowledge in working with students with, you know, who have potentially reading difficulties, and as special educators, they have a great deal of experience associated with, you know, working with those types of learners. What that means is that the current literacy interventionist our coach who is there, you know, would no longer be needed in that role, because we're already providing the literacy services, again, above and beyond what we're currently providing. But most importantly, which helps general educators probably as much as it helps our special educators, is someone is helping the general education teachers to differentiate lessons and instruction, and that's a value add that we absolutely need. So the reduction would be the literacy intervention.
So this is what I think I heard as well, which is where I was asking so many questions around it. When I looked at, you recall when we did this last week, I asked about seeing the ICT classes throughout the district and what the student sizes, what the class sizes of special education students per class look like. Is it fair to say that that this current kindergarten that's had 2 ICT classes with 3 special education students per class, that rising first grade class is going to have a single ICT class, and that's freeing up the FTE out of Hillside?
Yes, that's correct, Tim. The projections right now are
because
to go
what this does is it actually answers a question that I was a sort of back burner questions on my notepad here in terms of that staffing level in Hillside. So I thought that's where you're going to go with this. I get it. And it sounds like there's an additional piece, which is the existing literacy coach, reading interventionist. That position may be reduced because we're getting through movement of special education teachers. Okay.
Correct.
No, this is Gail. I'm just, I haven't been part of these conversations. So are we saying that we are cutting the literacy interventionist and we are not having small class in the middle school? Just for clarification, because Mr. Keough and I haven't been part of these discussions.
Right. This is new information to us as well, Gail, because we've been trying to process, you know, all of these reductions at the same time that we're trying to make sense of this program review report. And what we learned is that we would be able to serve the needs of our students who require literacy services through the shifts in the responsibilities of an existing special educator at the middle school, and the movement, as Laura described, of a teacher who was a special educator who was in Hillside, who will be moved there. So the literacy services will come from those 2 people who will have flexibility in their schedules to do this. And we're also, of course, you know, replacing the retirement, the special educator, because we have to, because of the needs of students with IEPs. We couldn't give up that position. So we'll have enough, FTE to support the literacy needs of students. And we can also, I mean, not that this is something the board, you know, may want to do, but, you know, we did reduce the FTE for the math interventionist. That has been very difficult to hire. This is always difficult to hire that kind of position at this point of the year. And I know that Gail and Chris have been, you know, dedicated to trying to fill that position. But if the board thought that they would want to do this, I'm just throwing this out there. This gives you a chance to make the math interventionist whole at both the middle school as well as at Hillside, because Hillside has a 0.8 math interventionist. And I know that's been an area that there's been a desire to increase. So I'm just throwing that out. That's just sort of a footnote. But the larger issue, Gail, is we would be able to cover the literacy FTE that's currently being that currently belongs to the person in your building who's offering that intervention.
So I just would like to say this: while the board was discussing the music teacher and a person being attached to that person, Eric Day, and we really didn't want to be talking about a particular person. We're now really talking about a person in our school who's probably listening, with Farragut Middle School staff listening, and this person has just heard that her position is being cut because administration didn't know it and she didn't know it. So I'm just going to ask us if we could be mindful and compassionate about the people that are working in our district that are now completely blindsided by some of this, as we are as well.
This is a proposal, Gail. The board is, it's up to them to decide to accept this proposal. All that at this point, this is still the superintendent's budget until the board, decides what to do, what they want to do, and accept it or reject it. But, this is, kind of a charge that we were given, earlier on in this conversation, which was to look throughout the schedules and departments to find ways to, make savings and to be more efficient. And this was done, even, before any conversations were had about, the charge that we have, which is to look at all this, look at our schedules and look at our departments to see that, to make sure that we're fully utilizing all staff members. So I can only say that, this is, part of, very much part of what, we need to respond to with regards to our special education program review, because that, that was undertaken for, for very specific reasons. And I fully understand and, would not want to attach a name to any of these positions, but sometimes it's the only way. If they're the singleton, if they're the one person in the building, it's almost impossible not, for someone not to know who it is. So it isn't an intentional, effort to, make someone, to embarrass someone or to, shock them. But, this is unfortunately, in this work session, this is the way this conversation has evolved. But I do understand.
Yeah, I'm sure it's not intentional. I also want to say that the same thing would be said for the special education teacher when we're talking about, the redesign of her, of what her program will look like next year. She had no idea that any of this was, was happening. So I just want us to be mindful of that. Thank you.
Absolutely.
I just want to say that as we're talking about the special ed budget, and this is kind of difficult waters to tread, I think, given what we've been through in the past several years. And I think in the context of what we're talking about and trying to address tonight about how we think about the budget, where do we make reductions? It's not at all the same thing, but I am reminded of what Tim brought up about transportation and how we think about transportation or providing busing, for example, for kids who go to private school. I think we have to be very mindful also in our special ed budget, even though there are things we certainly access and equity for all children is primary, but it's also hard to think about some cuts that get made and other things that get added at this time. And in terms of what Gail just had to say, I guess I hope that the administrators, administrative council, and Valerie, that you would all be speaking about this so that the principals, assistant principals would be a part of that conversation, even though it's not their area, that I think people all have to be communicating and on the same page about it and not get caught off guard or find out about it at a meeting like this. So I hope going forward that piece can all be spoken about amongst you.
Sure. I was asked the question, Jody. So, certainly, as I had said earlier, this discussion really requires, a full board presentation, and, talking about pieces of it, could get us into a corner. And so that's the reason, and so I'm asked the question about ICT, which, was asked at our last work session. And so I don't know if there was a way to not, answer that question without sharing the rest of the thinking that has been underway. But I do understand absolutely what you're saying.
Are there any other follow-on questions from the board with regards to anything that was just brought up on special education? And it certainly sounds like, and I realize that conversation, there's more to it. And it may be that we kind of waded into parts of it without having a full picture. Certainly don't have the full report and haven't had the benefit of understanding the recommendations from the consultant yet. And so I would reiterate what Valerie just said, which is these are proposals, and we need to really look at the proposal holistically to better understand how to move forward. What I might suggest is that we table the bond conversation for now, pick that up perhaps at the board meeting, and maybe just finish by talking about the 5th and 6th grade play and how to approach that. I know that there have been some thoughts, and we've gotten some emails about that. Perhaps Valerie, Maureen can give us a sense of where, or Melissa can give us a sense of where that stands right now.
Sure, I can jump in with that. So I've had the opportunity to work closely with Gerard. And so as part of our planning process, he was able to outline for me what the breakdown was and thinking about the different things that he's involved in. So when we're thinking about the 4th grade musical at Hillside, that's typically around $1,000. At Farragut, there's the 7th and 8th grade play, the 7th and 8th grade musical, the 6th grade musical, and the 5th grade musical as it currently exists, which amounts to approximately $7,500. And this is what he was saying in terms of, what a typical spread would be. And then at the high school play, the high school musical, and the Playwrights Festival, again, is about $7,500. So the discussion, and that totals roughly, $16,000. He had originally requested $17,000 because in the past, things have gone over. And what we discussed was working with $15,000 so that there would be a slight reduction, and that would require going back to combining the 5th and 6th grade or eliminating the 5th grade. He was able to communicate that there would be an impact on that. And he was very constructive in proposing solutions. And he said what we could do is one of two things. And one would be to have a concert where the kids are singing in groups and trying to have soloists. And the second would be a traditional musical show where there would have to be a selection process for the students that have auditioned. And that hasn't historically been done. And I know that this was something the correspondence was also shared with the board. So those were some of the early discussions. And the reason he expressed concern is because there's just been such a large number of students participating that he expressed that it would be very difficult to double cast for something like that. He was incredibly collaborative and very open-minded about those two alternate solutions so that we could still preserve that. But that was some of the thinking around 5th and 6th grade.
So to build on what Melissa just stated, as part of our task for next week, we can, Melissa can work with the building leaders and Gerard to look at, the existing allocation for fine arts to ensure that, across that budget, there are funds that are dedicated to the fifth grade play. And so there would need to be some decisions made, but I do understand, what the board is asking with regards to the fifth grade play, that, that's an important experience. The fine arts are very important as music education is in the district. And I think, as Melissa indicated, we would, that there, we have an opportunity to go back and look at the entire budget for fine arts and figure out how to better, distribute those funds across the different, plans for next year, so that there are funds available for the fifth grade play.
Yeah, they're gonna have
So
to
we'll
look
bring
at
that
really the stipends, because what Melissa's referring to is just really the additional cost. But what we proposed in the original, what was proposed was actually what was reflective of that, like savings, was not filling 4 stipends plus the costs associated with putting on the production. So it's roughly around $20,000 or so.
Okay. So that money, if I'm understanding the board correctly, what we need to do is look at the entire fine arts, budget and find that $20,000 so that the fifth grade play is restored. Is that what the board is asking us to do?
Well, I can just give some of my thoughts, but I think the reason that it's, that I kind of think it's a really important thing is that it's kind of a rite of passage for fourth graders to be in the play. They've kind of waited their whole Hillside career to be in the play. They've seen all the plays, and they're not getting to do that this year. And so for the fifth graders to have a true experience to do it next year, it's probably more important than a seventh or eighth grader, to be honest. I mean, they've done plays for 3 or 4 years. Not saying that they shouldn't do their plays as well, but it's kind of a double whammy by not doing the play this year, and then also, I mean, the options that were laid out are both pretty bad, right? I mean, there's 80 kids per. I think it's like 80 kids per class, like 150, 160 kids that would be kind of sharing. It wouldn't be a true play, or doing cuts for fifth graders just doesn't seem fair or right or adequate. So, Maureen, I know you had mentioned there were a couple of ways that you could potentially trim that 20,000 down by maybe cutting out some of the staff or having some volunteers. If there's a way to do it for less, but having a true experience that they're missing this year, I think would be really valuable and really important.
Yeah, I think there's a way to do it. I think Melissa will work with him. And if you look across it, there's ways to tweak things here and there that I believe, and I have to look at what the cut is, because I'm now the stipends, I may have included some of those extra costs. Maybe it's even closer to 15. So it may just be a matter of going back and looking at all the productions and seeing where maybe one position for one may not be as necessary, and that would help and offset to put back some, whatever the level of staffing, because, there has been an expansion of the positions for each production, and maybe there's a way to either, shave down some of those positions and choose productions that may be less costly to put on. And I think between those, they probably, that's my guess. So I'm sure it could be done. So Melissa, I guess, will work with him, and then we can come back with something.
Yeah, and look, I would just chime in as well. I think Jeremy makes some really, really good points there. And I think, we try to be collaborative, right? Go back to Gerard and see where could he give and where, might the board meet in the middle type of thing. It's relatively speaking, compared to so many of the other numbers we're talking about, it's a small number, and it's such an important experience for these fifth graders. You can see my line of thought is highly fifth grade focused. So yeah, I think pushing on, the theater department and Gerard to make some cuts where they can, and finding out, okay, if it's some residual, small residual amount of money that's needed to make this happen. It's an important thing to happen.
Sure. I think, it goes back to what the board was talking about earlier, which is having some choices. So one of them was to do the reduction of the 5th grade play, and the other would be to tighten our belt with some of the other productions, and so that there could be some efficiencies there that could be reallocated. So I'll work with Gerard together, and we'll come back around.
I know we're going to talk about another thing, but I just wanted to make sure that in case you're going to close the meeting anytime soon, we're going to restore the music to the budget, and that'll bring us up closer to the tax cap. Then we will either, tell you what the difference between those two numbers are, and either if there's somewhere else we can kind of make an adjustment, because roughly the restoration of the position is probably like 150,000 or something in that. So it'll be just by, we do have some money in the tax cap. Am I also looking to potentially move the students? Like, are you looking for a proposal for a change in the way we transport our private school students? I mean, it doesn't
yeah, we're looking
so
for
are we looking
options.
to actually do that,
Well, we're just looking for options there. I mean, even if they're somewhat, even if they're unappealing options, I think we need to know what we're choosing between, and that's all we're saying.
No, that's fine. I just, again, because there's so much different work that has to go on in between these meetings, that just trying to understand, is that something, you really are, if we were to just move the high school students, but again, then you have a bus going to Hackley that may have younger kids on it, and then you're just moving the older kids off of it, so I guess I can offer you some, but the analysis that it does, requires a little bit, so is that something you would be, if I were to present it next week, is that something everyone is like kind of committed to doing, or does anybody feel that we shouldn't be, changing?
Well, just finish your sentence. You said the analysis is a little blank.
No, I think it's,
I guess what we're trying to figure out is just, what task, we realize we're giving a lot of tasks, and I think it'd be good for us to know, it's always easy for a bunch of people to kind of give tasks and someone else has to do the tasks. So, is it your sense that, what maybe, for example, one way to go about it is say, hey, here's some things I could look to really price out. It's going to take some time and energy and a lot of, elbow grease to make it happen. And it would look like this, and then, we could kind of just say, yeah, it'll price that out, or not.
The direction you're saying to leave the elementary kids on the buses, but anyone over, so I mean, if you gave me some understanding, then I could. So anyone above grade what would go on public transportation?
I haven't thought about that, so I don't know the answer to that question.
It's somewhat arbitrary, but at least we just see what the numbers look like. I don't think that this is an actionable point that you just turn around and do this, but you want to just pick it at 7th grade and above, you take public transportation and just see what it looks like.
Okay.
And the simpler solutions like single bus stop and things like that.
We're doing those anyway. Those are things
those are already built in, right? They're already built in. Okay.
They're going to be transfer points. So what we're going to do is, because we're already going to have to do that, we're putting Edgemont on, like if people pick up our bus, then it'll probably mean that other people will come to a central pickup point, because that's what our transportation director, we can move people to bus stops, so we may do that where it makes sense. So it'll like make the ride more efficient. It may look different for everyone. And again, they'll have to kind of see where everyone's going to school, and not everyone has submitted their out of district requests, or they should be, because it got extended. The state extended the deadline for that. But once they have that and have Edgemonts, they'll come up with and they may say, okay, in this scenario, people have to go to a central pickup point. But what's going to be even more, the cost efficiency is in the transfer point. So kids will have to switch buses anyway. Our private school students will, in what we're suggesting, I just don't know what it's going to look like yet. We've taken some reductions based upon what the transportation director, that's where you see those cuts in transportation that have been reflected. you know, we had hoped to reduce it further. The thing that's causing us the issue right now is the fact that that we got dropped by our out-of-district our transportation provider. So, you know, I would have felt more comfortable if we had a steady contract, even assuming a little bit better budget savings there. But the idea was that there will be, even some of our CSC kids will potentially have transition points too in this plan, because it really needs to work that way for it. Not necessarily central pickup points, but transitional buses, because then you kind of getting everybody, it may be that everyone drives to Irvington and hops on a bigger bus. Like there will be a switch off in buses. So that's what we're looking at. That's what has been planned for. And that's what we're planning. That's what, people are agreeing to at this point in the river towns. And that's reflective in our budget. So if we weren't in agreement with doing those things, that number would actually go up. But, you know, the other option, which of course is less expensive, is to, put like kids in again. That was something that I know the board was asked, and there was some interest in doing that, so, I'll provide you that information.
Okay.
Can I go back to the 5th grade play idea for just a sec, to throw out another option? I know that there have been times in 5th grade when the teachers within their own classrooms have had the students write and act in their own little classroom play, and the parents came in. That happened 2 years ago, I know. So if funds can't be found, maybe that would be, you'd have to check with that team, but to see if they're still doing that sort of thing. The nice part about, I know it's not on the big stage, it's something that they create and perform in their own class space. But the nice thing about that is that all the kids participate, not just the ones who decide, oh, I want to be in be in this play. So that was kind of a nice moment to see in 5th grade, everybody being part of writing and acting.
And they still do that?
I know that they did it 2 years ago when my son was in 5th grade.
They've been doing it for like 25 years.
Yes, the 5th grade teachers all do it.
Yeah. But it's just another option I thought I'd throw out there as a way to include all 5th graders if the team was amenable and there weren't funds.
Mm-hmm. The other thing I was thinking about, when we're talking about, I don't think that there'd be well, I don't know, you never know, but if with the state aid, which I think we should just hold at this point, because to Valerie's point, even if the first April 30th information we're given, again, that's only based on, it's probably based on it's based on a 3-month period, which would include some COVID, some pre-COVID. So it's going to be like a blended number, because that's not just reflective of like the last month for the state. It's a quarter's worth of earnings. So it may not show the full impact. We may not on April 30th know the full fiscal impact of the state, because again, that's only a very short period of time that'll reflect it'll reflect half the quarter for them, not the full quarter of their budget, right? Because they're on a different budget cycle than we are, because their start of their fiscal year is actually April 1st. So they really have not been too far into this to kind of understand long term. But I guess my question, just very broadly, because in thinking about the budget, holistically, say if there was even let's say we get more tuition students, just say, would the thought process be to lower the tax rate, or would it be to add back things? I mean, I guess that's because there are maybe a possibility of a few, if there's a little tweaks here and there that we end up like with, like as an example, we may have the only reason I throw that out there is even if we had a new tuition student anywhere or in the special ed, because those things do happen. And I just because I want to make sure that we're clear on what it is. Right now, we're restoring the music position, looking at the 5th grade. If in fact we were to like say, oh, good news, we're getting, potentially another 100,000. Are we kind of done? Do we have a sense of we're like holding all the other cuts except world language for now and proceeding with developing that into the budget? And then if there were some additional dollars, either that would be used we would not necessarily restore or reduce our tax rate, but rather take those revenues as a way to offset any additional cuts we may have. Because I think it's just things may shift a bit between now and the end of the year. And if there were some updated information such as that, like where we had some positive revenue news, would we be like, what would the thought be on that? Or if we found additional transportation savings, I think that's a good example. If I was like, oh, you're going to save 150, 200, would we then just say, hey, we should really just hold our budget and hold, this because we don't know what other revenues we may lose?
And I want to just point out some new information I learned today, which you already probably know, Maureen, that whatever COVID, cares, funds that districts are going to receive. So the state gets, most of it. And then there's some that, is allocated to districts. So that allocation is based upon the Title I formula.
Mm-hmm.
So, which means we will not get a lot of funds. Our current Title I allocation is what, roughly 34,000 around that amount.
That's what they restore to us. That's what they restore to us. If you look at the state aid run and see the reduction, that's exactly the amount of money we got back from the CARES Act. But I guess, I don't have a lot of faith that we're going to see a big windfall from the state. And even if Homo was, able to get it, I guess, is there, outside of the things that people have mentioned tonight, I think, the only ones we've talked about music, we know we're restoring music, that's back in the budget. That comes off the list. That's, the position is retained in our budget. World language, we're looking into a few things as we're looking across everyone's schedules and seeing if there could be a creative way to not, to keep world language, but not necessarily to replace the person retiring. And then we're looking at the 5th grade. Other than that, because if there were to be either, like I said, some additional savings found, because I do think it's important. I'm not, when I ask you about the out of district transportation, I just want to make sure that we're all really clear, because I'm just saying, because I did live through where we put it on the table, and then the parents that impacted it were very angry as well. And just to be clear that, that some of the routes would not be, some are fine, but they may not all be as, they may be challenging, some of them. But if we were to find savings there, are we just doing it to reduce our budget? That's what I just want to make sure I'm clear on.
Hey, Maureen. Question about the district busing?
Yeah.
Well,
yes.
Are kids that are going to schools like Windward and Eagle Hill factored into that when you're talking about out-of-district busing, or is it just kids that are? No,
they're considered, I have them in parentally placed, so they're captured because they're actually under different guidelines too, and that's the reason they are captured separately, because they are children with IEPs, and we're required to transport them up to 60 miles away, and private school students can't be transported more than 15 miles away from their home. So there's kids who go to private schools that we don't transport. There are kids out of district beyond those 23.
All this analysis about public transportation and all this other stuff, is that just for the, I assume, we talking about just the 23 kids that are kind of like
yes.
private schools that are not special education schools, right?
Correct.
And so, Maureen, can I give you my thoughts as to why to do this analysis? I think that we restored the music position. Everyone is collectively working their tail off about how do we maintain certain programs without adding FTEs, obviously. And I think at a future point, we're going to be talking about the difference between monies spent in this fiscal year versus monies raised, and what we have the potential to put back into reserves. And that's going to be another conversation that the board's going to need to be online with. And restoring reserves, I think, as everybody sort of collectively understands, particularly as we look at those 5-year projections, is going to be just critically important. I think the point, at least for me, the point of doing the exercise with out-of-district busing is that it has been, for good reason, a lightning rod of how can we get costs down. And it's legitimately not too soon to understand how much can we reasonably reduce here and at what cost to students in terms of the ease of their transport, even if it's not enacted in the 2020 budget, because then at least we understand what the lever is in the 21-22 budget when it's going to be really hard. So I don't think we need to walk away as a group of 10 saying, figure out these numbers because we're going to enact these numbers straight away. But I think we're talking repeatedly about this line item. So it's just part of the analysis work that we're trying to do, at least speaking for myself. That's why I want to see those numbers.
No, that's fine. And again, I think we'll see where we are. And I mean, even if the board decided, again, whatever you decide when I give you the analysis, I think what we're hoping will happen, even though it'll be a tremendous amount of work, is that if we do end up taking over our own transportation, that following year, I know that we can do it more efficiently. It's just that we need to invest in it to do that. And then maybe at that point, if we were to be able to run these runs at a much lower cost, then it would be something that would be our goal, of course, and for all of our runs. But and I think that's what we know we can get to. So maybe if we, don't do something, the goal is always to be more efficient, right? So we can look at it, and I'll also have our transportation department look at if they were to either, extend some of the runs and make it like look at it a few different ways and see if there's a way to either, bring down the cost, versus the public and, have a couple options.
Yeah, I think that's great. Even if it,
this or that.
I'm sorry.
I think I just was thinking about what are the deliverables, it's restore the math on math, music, look at what the transportation, come back with some type of detailed analysis to kind of look at if there's alternate ways to transport those students and what the savings may be in doing that. And then I just wanted to also have an understanding of, as we find operational savings, and if there were, any additional revenues that we either, end up having, or, something in the tuition or something like that, that could be potential, would our goal be to reduce the tax levy? Is that it, or is that not? Are we staying at the max tax cap levy?
Can we table that?
Yeah,
for
let's
908?
table
Can we
that.
table that until let's have the more complete reserve discussion as a board? Because
Are we having that tonight?
The two go hand in hand.
No, and I agree. I do think that's probably, to me, the biggest piece, and we haven't, to me it is, because it's thinking about the multiple, the multi-year look at the budget, which I think is critical when you make any decision for next year. If you you can't make a decision for 1 year without knowing about the year after, or the two, with the best, information we have for us today. So I know there's a lot of talk about, we're not, I guess my question is right now the use of that money, is the board not looking to use any of that money to restore positions, but rather to either put it into reserves and or reduce taxes? Because there was 3 options. So are we saying that the restoration of anything is off the table with any savings we have this year?
I think that's a discussion for once we have a chance to take a look at the analysis and look at all the options holistically. I don't think it really factors into the analysis that you'd be.
Well, I think it's the point of that, Jeremy. The money is non-recurring, right? So if you're doing it, you're using it to fund something that the funding will go away for next year. So I guess, what are your thoughts on that? Because the other analysis is going to be important, but just the philosophy of doing that. I would just be interested if you're saying that you'd be interested in doing that.
Well, to me, at this point, I think that, we have to be very open to the conversation of going up to the tax cap to restore the music position, because, you know, I mean, we'll see what the transport, you know, savings could be. And, you know, that is, it sounds like, you know, potentially still a moving variable. And so what would be good to understand is, you know, how much can we keep those costs down? Because if we can't, and that just creeps right back into the budget, then yeah, we're in a situation where we're having to use reserves to pay for these positions, which, you know, creates a sustainability problem.
Yeah,
So
I think even if you look at the transportation, the best case scenario is that number, and I'm talking about, and again, without knowing what the rebid is, which is very, very stressful. You know, at best, like you can maybe potentially save half of that money. Like I would say, only just basing it on the last time, because I don't think Metro North, you know, train passes are not cheap, even for students. So
half of which item? Half of which item?
Maybe half, because I know that in looking at it, I don't have it right in front. I have it on another sheet. I don't want to switch around when I'm on, you know, because I get distracted looking at sheets. But if I remember, there's a good amount of those kids that are elementary, right? So out of the 23, there could be 10 that are elementary. So you're putting them on private buses. And I'm saying at best, if you put people on Beeline, I'm saying, I'm just making now a guess, and I'm going to perform the task that you asked me to do. But just keep in mind, like maybe you save $35,000, $40,000 by doing that. And I
so
think that,
is your question then to follow up on that, is your question then, in order to pay for the music teacher, do we go into reserves or do we go into
no, I think we can
tax
figure that
cap?
out. No, so I think I can figure, so right now we're 130 under. I think with a couple, we'll find it, don't worry about that. I'll find the 20,000, we'll go back and I'll get rid of, you know, whatever, we'll reduce a copy or whatever, we'll figure that out. You know, we'll close that gap. But what I'm saying is outside of that, we know we have expenditure savings, whether it's the entire amount that we shared, because like Valerie and I discussed earlier, if there's some, you know, type of thing from the state saying we have to pay our transportation contracts, then a lot of that savings we've been talking about vanishes. I'm assuming pretty strongly there is no sports, so we know that's pretty guaranteed savings, and, you know, security and different things that we're absolutely saving money on. My question to you is, is the board, because I think the reserve conversation is important, are we
Yes.
clear that we're not taking that money to restore positions? Like, what if there's $500,000 left at the end of this year that would have not been normally left over? Is anyone suggesting that we use that money to restore positions?
No, I'm not. I can say that. I think that puts us in a really,
like how to move forward.
I think that puts us in a really dangerous position in the future, especially given the fact that we really don't know what next year is going to look like, and we don't know what sort of revenue shortfalls we're going to have. I think that would be, you know, kind of almost, although it's not pennies we're talking about, so it's a silly expression, but it's going to be whatever the version of penny wise, pound foolish is when you're talking about much larger dollar amounts.
Right.
And I think the last thing we need to do is start figuring out, you know, wow, we cut really close to the bone here. We used everything, and we're now in a situation where is to operate what we thought was going to be the set of things we needed to operate in the district. We're going to have to go and we're going to have to cut some of them. I personally don't want to be in that position.
I think we want to have it where that once we go into next year, we will not have to cut anything mid-year. I mean, I think that's what we're setting ourselves up to. And any money that we have in the reserves, if God forbid something were to, you know, even if say the state were to take another 10%, having that money there, I would say what we would recommend is we would never, I've never seen it done here, but I don't think we would ever want to recommend any type of mid-year reduction or cut, because that's terrible.
That would be disastrous.
Like, you know, you know, just to make sure that we're, you know, covered, and that when we go into next year, for the next 12 months, that we're like being very mindful of the tax rate, because I do think that it's such a hard part of this conversation, because this is, you know, a time in which people are going to be very focused on, you know, any type of increase. And I know that'll be part of the bond conversation, I'm sure, as, you know, in the next meeting. But we certainly want to make sure that we don't, once we set our budget, that we can meet all of our obligations next year. And having putting some of that money into fund balance, although I know we have some fund balance, I think will serve us over the next 2 or 3 years. And I know that, Tim and I I know different board members have had conversations about it. And it's a really tricky thing because I know that maybe people are feeling, they would like to see some tax relief and things like that. But I think we have to be strategic and look at it over the next 2 or 3 years, but be very careful not to use it as like a slush fund to restore positions.
Yeah, so let me just share my philosophical view around this, because I've also been very vocal around these different positions with fifth grade world language and driving in questions around ICT staffing, particularly in Hillside, was my sort of point of interest. As Maureen just referenced, she and I had a conversation around reserve balances, understanding that the difference between revenues generated in 2019-20 school year versus those spent create a pretty significant excess, if you will. I think philosophically and for board members, you can turn your attention to the reserve discussion sheet at the end of the deck to get an idea of potential for restoring our reserves. That's tax cert, that's employee benefit, that's retirement system, the employee retirement system, TRS reserves. I think to really just echoing the points just made by Maureen and Doug, it really is important to get these reserves back to, I think the adjective is just a good and healthy level. Those are the adjectives I would use. Running the numbers earlier today didn't come up with anything that was extraordinary, but rather just trying to at least target potential reserves for June 2020 that approximate reserves we had in June 2019. I think that puts us, I think working with less, the way I'm thinking about it is working with less puts us at risk of, and this is what Maureen is saying, but really dramatic cuts at 21-22 that materially impact education and staffing levels and therefore in turn impact kids. That said, the one caveat before, I think what you'd like to hear, Maureen, I think the question you're asking is, are we 100% behind not adding anything back at this point as we move forward? And
well, I guess my question is more, not so much as you want to add things back, but are you planning on adding them back by using the savings from this year? Because
by using the savings of this year, sorry, yeah, that's understood. So that is exact phrasing the question. And so the only thing, but at a personal level, I think that I need to see the work done on this world language program and the feasibility of the world language program. And I need to understand, given the information that was just brought up around, staffing changes throughout, or I don't even want to use the phrase staffing changes, but the moving pieces that exist around special education and inclusion facilitator role. Sorry, I was struggling to think of the role, but the discussion of an inclusion facilitator role, I need to see the details and get the feedback from the work that Melissa and Valerie and building leaders are going to do around this before I can guarantee something. So as much as I would like to be able to say yes, and the reason I've talked about where I am philosophically is philosophically I am there with you 100%. But we have some now outstanding questions that have direct staffing and program related issues, and we just need to see the answers to, or at least I need to see the answers to those to make a final informed decision.
The only thing that I would suggest, the one thing we do have to think about in terms of the excess funds that we may, we'll have available at the end of this year, outside of putting money in the reserves, there were just a few items that were on the table that had not been added to the budget proposal. One of which was the summer, some type of, whether it be the summer or throughout the school year, a program to ensure that any kids that may have fallen behind, that there was some money for that. That's still not, folded in. I think we were talking about it as an extended school program. We also, and this has come up after discussions, I think sometimes board members have brought up these points, which are really smart points, and Valerie also had mentioned it, that, is there a possibility that if when we come back to school, are we going to see higher absenteeism? And is there a reason we should consider putting a few dollars back? So if there was a consideration, I don't believe it's used to restore positions because that's a one-off, but there may be reasons to put money out of the savings this year as an offset to increase lines that we believe will only be like elevated for a year. So if we think that our substitute costs may be up a bit next year over our normal average, then there may be a time where we increase that budget line by, like, let's just say $15,000, $20,000, because there may be people that are under quarantine and different reasons that we may have to, that happens, and we've seen it happen, and, being the schools closed, it really doesn't matter. But if they were like to have a person in their house, they would be quarantined, we would have to get a substitute, or anyone in the system for that matter. So I think there was a question about, do we think next year until this thing is maybe behind us, do we think we're going to have some increased costs next year, whether it be, Valerie had mentioned the overtime for cleaners. That wasn't something I really initially had. This year we were able to handle it. We closed schools. We had 2 days. We did it within our manpower for the most part, a couple hours maybe here or there to close the job out on Sunday. But if we were to if every time there was a case told to us, by whomever, by a person, by the county, are we I would imagine we're going to be required to close schools and do that full cleaning protocol if in September there was a student or a staff member that was, either identified as having COVID. So again, Valerie had mentioned, we don't have the luxury of closing schools for 4 days and 3 days or 2 days. Like, would we then, increase our overtime budget with this understanding that anytime we need to clean our building, we would probably, put our staff on, whatever the overtime would be required to get us back in the building ASAP.
The next day.
Yeah. So
I think that's, Maureen, can I just stop you here? I think that your proposal, I mean, the theory behind your proposal makes a lot of sense. And if you're able to just put what your projected,
Sure.
set of line items are, then I think that should be an easy enough conversation to have.
So I'm going to suggest, like, if there's money left over this year, like whatever those dollars are, and those would be things that we would potentially, out of that, outside of putting money in the reserves, there may be a couple one-offs that we think are non-recurring costs that we think we should add in. Does that make sense to everybody?
So, and just so I'm clear on orders of magnitude here, let's just say for round numbers, it's $700,000 in savings, and you're suggesting what, $50,000, or you're talking about. I mean, I guess if there was some larger programmatic thing that we were trying to do, it could be upwards towards the 100 or two, but without understanding that order of magnitude, and maybe we put certain things aside and other things we don't. But yeah, let's just look at that as a proposal. And I think I can speak on behalf of the board. I hope I'm not, that I think the board would be open to considering those proposals and to use them out of what would normally just go into reserves.
I think there may be just some reason to put a couple dollars for those things.
Yeah,
There's a definite need for us to prepare for post-COVID-19, types of costs. Maureen and I were discussing masks and rubber gloves, today, and how many she's ordered, because, if we, for example, if we do come back in September or before September, and social distancing is still a very important part of, this, mitigation efforts around COVID-19. It is our belief that, adults and students are going to be required to wear a mask and gloves in school. that's not a far-fetched, idea. So we've got to think about making sure that we're prepared for that. That's an additional cost. We've never purchased, masks and gloves at that volume. So that's one. We also know, I just learned today that at the commissioner's level, in the commissioner's office, there was a conversation today about, the social, emotional, and mental health needs of students as a result of, not being in their schools. For many children, many more than we would think, and who are not necessarily from families where, there may be, disruption in the family, but students who are, experiencing a great deal of social, emotional, and mental, stress as a result of not being in school, which is, a safe haven for so many children on so many levels. So there's an anticipation that in addition to, a summer program, compensatory program that we talked about at our last work session, there's going to be a need for related services, school counseling, psychologists, social workers at a level that, we may not even anticipate. But I think we need to gear up and be prepared for that. So that proposed summer compensatory program or extended year program, Laura and TASFA manage the extended school program or extended year program as it exists now, which is driven by CSE. But the compensatory program would include, many more students, across mandated services and other students who don't have mandated services. So that's a real potential. And then there's conversation about the reentry, into, whenever school opens again, there's certain things that are going to be different that could potentially, result in increased costs for security, increased costs for managing, the flow of children, if we have to still maintain, guidelines around social distancing. So I'll end there with that focus.
If I could, I think the board is certainly open to, looking at all those costs and funding them out of something that would potentially be not recurring. So so let's just put that down as a set of proposals with some specifics behind it, and then we can consider that at our next meeting. Did you have something, Jeremy? Tim?
No, it's Tim. It's just, the one thing I'd say is that we've had this conversation. We had this conversation some last week as well, and it continues. Mm-hmm. I'm trying to balance removing or potentially removing, which is why I just keep coming back saying I want to see what we can do with world language. Right. But I'm trying to balance removing something that our students have had for years to prepare something in anticipation of something we think is going to happen, right? And I don't doubt the challenges of educating and teaching in a post-COVID world, right? But just try to understand the dissonance that I hear of removing something that has existed, fifth grade world language, and why I want to keep coming back to this, while anticipating and preparing for new things.
Yeah, but Tim, one is a recurring expense and one is a one-time cost.
One, I get that. Number two, ESY was a recurring expense for many, many years until it was dropped in 2008 because of a financial. So if we're talking about it as a one-off, may or may not be. So just,
Yeah, but we could certainly put that sort of stipulation as a board saying, look, we're willing to fund this thing for a year. And so if we say to the administration who puts this forward, hey, what do you think of this? It's a year. I said, well, that's what we can fund it for, because if it's beyond that, we can't fund it. That's going to have to go into the decision process. So, I mean, personally, I see them as two different topics.
Well, here's the counterpoint. You're going to have fifth grade world language for 1 year, and if we're in a tight budget spot, we're having the same conversation in 21, 22, and it gets cut. Everything in the budget exists for 1 year. So
I think we're just conflating a lot of different things here, because fifth grade, I just think there's a lot of different. I mean, fifth grade world languages existed for many years. I think we can all agree that we're in a, I mean, certainly only in my lifetime. We could argue once in 100 years sort of situation. Hopefully, it doesn't become more frequent than that. And so I think we're looking at things a little bit differently. But I mean, I can't imagine a world in which extra cleaning supplies, something we're buying all the time. These, programs to get kids up to speed who've now missed 5 months of school, children who have, kind of special needs in order that they need that. If that turns out to be an ongoing need, we got other problems, big problems, societal problems. So I'm hoping that's not what we're talking about here. But if it is, let us know, and that's a different set of decision criteria.
I mean, having that money for a reentry plan, I think is just, I think it's critical. And like I understand, Tim, I don't think anyone really knows, and that's why, we try to do our best thinking and put down a budget number that reflects knowing what it looked like in the past, but not knowing what the real need will be. Like Valerie said, we don't know how extensive the needs may be, but trying to put some money and some thought, some dollars aside, because I think there will, what it'll end up being, we don't know, but there will be some level of need there, for kids to re-enter the school district. I can't imagine it can't be,
My point is simply, I don't disagree with either of you. I don't disagree with either of you at all. I don't care for removing what I consider to be part of material program while simultaneously doing all this preparatory work for the issues ahead. I think the two, they don't jive with me.
Well, let's look at it. Let's get the actual proposals for what those items are, and then let's talk about it then when we have something, actual in front of us. So just to
be like a recommendation for the amount of money that we think we have left. I just want to be clear what we're doing next time to reflect what we think those additional needs will be. Then a recommendation for, additional monies that we believe should go to different reserves and the rationale why. Although we'd like start to do that work, but looking at the pool of money. And then, and again, if there's anything that we find out, like I said, I just happen to know there's actually a potential of another, we may save some money in transportation. There may be other things that as some of these things come up, we may have savings elsewhere to, by looking at transportation or or maybe having some additional revenues that may be outside of this other conversation. Because I think that's what needs to happen to restore other positions. We need to either find other reductions like savings, which I think we're going to work at least on the transportation I'll look at. And then if there are any other potentials for revenue, because that's an area, and then it's a sustainable way to bring back something if there was something or some other need that needed to be addressed. That's but not thinking that money is going to do it.
So it seems like we've really only made two decisions tonight. One is to add the music back in, and the other one is that we are not going to hire another world language person at this point, but we're going to look at creative ways in order to address some of we're just not creative ways. We're going to look across some of the more elective courses to figure out some different options. The other things are all, continuing to look at proposals, every other topic, whether it's busing or some of the stuff around special ed or the fifth grade play, I guess, is one we didn't really come to any. Did we come to any sort of clarity on a potential next step there? Or was that another one we're going to come back with some thoughts and options?
We're going to come back afterwards,
Okay.
After we have time, after Melissa has time to talk to Gerard to look at that budget, along with speaking to the building leadership teams. So that fifth grade play will have to come out of the existing dollars that are allocated, and that they have to have that conversation and to see how to make that happen. That's what my understanding is.
Okay. So everything else are still some options that we're looking to at different variables as we move forward. Okay. Is there anything anyone has in final parting thoughts they feel are important to share today?
I know you're going to kill me, but can you just tell me, are we talking about the bond the next time? And if so, what do you need? And what do you mean by talking about the bond? Like, is there anything I need to prepare or, get information?
I think at a bare minimum, just what the current thinking is. I mean, I think the public is at the board meeting, the public's going to wonder, hey, you know, we passed this bond, it has financial implications. I think there's a lot of variables involved. You know, some could be that we're, you know, getting, you know, potentially very low interest rates and cheap labor. Some would be that we do some selective work. I mean, there's just so many options on the table. Even if we say, here's the options, and we have
anything. That's what I was trying to figure out. Should I be preparing something that, you know, reflects some different options?
Well, I would say let's at least open the conversation. If you could even just send a discussion document with a few key points around it, you know, that could be helpful. Nothing, I wouldn't go into some, you know, 40 slide presentation deck. Seems like overkill at this point. Okay. You know, when in doubt, do less slides and just kind of form some stuff into a few bullet points. Okay. Anything else? All right. All right. Well, thank you everyone for a very involved conversation, and for everyone in the public who's listened. And I realize these are never easy conversations, and we're really trying to move through them with as much thoughtfulness and care as possible. And we'll continue to do that as we move forward. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Night.
Good night.
Good night.